A gunshot cracks through the frozen Wyoming night, not from a weapon, but from ice splitting on the lake. Inside her apothecary, Mylene's hands freeze over a mortar of herbs as the sound echoes the moment her husband's body hit the ground 18 months ago. Outside, a rancher dismounts his horse, blood seeping through his shirt. Not his own blood, but a lamb's, stillborn in his arms. Two broken people. One impossible choice: stay buried in grief or risk everything for a love that could destroy them both. This is their story. Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from so I can see how far this journey takes us. The winter of 1891 came to Sweetwater, Wyoming, with the cruelty of a creditor collecting debts. It swept down from the mountains with teeth of ice and claws of wind, stripping the valley of color until everything, the buildings, the hills, even the people, became variations of the same desolate gray. The town itself huddled against the assault like a wounded animal, its single main street flanked by wooden structures that groaned beneath the weight of accumulated snow. At the far eastern edge of town, where the respectable establishments gave way to the forgotten corners, stood a narrow building with faded Chinese characters painted above the door. Most townspeople couldn't read the symbols and didn't care to learn. They knew it simply as the Chinaman's shop, though the Chinaman himself had been dead for a year and a half. Inside, Mylene Chen moved through the dimness like a ghost haunting her own life. The apothecary smelled of things that made the white townspeople nervous: star anise and dried chrysanthemum, ginseng root, and tiger balm, scents that spoke of a world they couldn't begin to understand and therefore chose to fear. Glass jars lined shelves that climbed to the ceiling, each one labeled in Mylene's careful calligraphy, each one holding remedies that her husband Wee had taught her to prepare. Wee. Even thinking his name made something crack inside her chest, like that ice on the lake. She was grinding herbs in a stone mortar. The rhythmic work helped quiet her mind, when the bell above the door chimed. Mylene didn't look up immediately. In the 18 months since Wee's death, she'd learned to read her customers by their footsteps alone. The heavy, deliberate tread usually meant a ranch hand with a work injury, too proud to admit he needed help. The quick, light steps belonged to the women who came after dark, seeking remedies for problems their husbands weren't supposed to know about. The hesitant shuffle indicated someone new, someone not yet sure if crossing the threshold meant making a deal with the devil. These footsteps were different. Slow, but not hesitant. Heavy, but not aggressive. They carried a weight that had nothing to do with size. Mylene raised her eyes. The man who stood in her doorway was tall, which most white men seemed to her, with shoulders broad enough to block out the weak afternoon light. He wore a rancher's typical uniform: work-worn denim, a sheepskin coat dark with melted snow, boots that had seen more mud than any attempt at polish. His hat was in his hands, which surprised her. Most men kept their hats on in her shop, a small act of disrespect they probably didn't even recognize as intentional, but it was his face that caught her attention. Not because it was handsome, though the strong jaw and clear eyes might have been called that once. No, what stopped her was the expression it wore, or rather, the lack of one. This was a face that had forgotten how to arrange itself for the world. It was the face of someone who'd been alone too long. She recognized it because she saw the same thing in her mirror every morning. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough from disuse, "I'm told you might have something for a wound that won't quite heal." His accent marked him as local, probably second or third generation in this territory. There was none of the affected superiority she'd heard from the men who'd come west with money and education. This was a man born to hard land and harder winters. Mylene set down her mortar and wiped her hands on her apron. She was 32 years old, though grief had added years to her face that no amount of the pearl cream she made could erase. Her hair, still fully black, was pulled into a tight bun at the nape of her neck. She wore a simple blue cotton tunic over dark pants, clothing that scandalized the town women who believed proper ladies should suffocate in corsets and drown in petticoats. "Show me," she said in English. Her accent turned the words slightly musical, though she'd long since stopped caring whether people found it charming or foreign. The man, she guessed him to be in his early 40s, glanced around the shop as if expecting to find someone else present. When he confirmed they were alone, he shrugged out of his coat and began unbuttoning his shirt. Mylene had seen countless injuries in her years helping Wee, and later running the shop alone. Knife wounds from kitchen accidents and bar fights, burns from stoves and forge fires, the peculiar injuries that came from a life lived with animals and machinery. She'd trained herself not to react, to see flesh as simply another form of territory requiring navigation. But when the man pulled his shirt aside to reveal his left shoulder, she drew in a sharp breath. The wound itself was old, weeks, maybe months. A jagged scar ran from his collarbone toward his shoulder blade, angry and red at the edges, the kind of injury that spoke of something torn rather than cut. But that wasn't what made her breath catch. It was the way he'd exposed it, the vulnerability in the gesture. The skin around the wound was inflamed, hot to the touch even from where she stood. "Infection," she said simply. "How long?" 3 months, near about. Got kicked by a horse. Thought it was healing proper, but about 2 weeks ago it started getting angry again." "You see doctor?" The man's jaw tightened. "Doc Pritchard won't see me." Myling didn't ask why. She'd learned that everyone who came to her shop came carrying stories they didn't want to tell. The why of their arrival mattered less than the what of their need. She moved to one of her shelves, her fingers finding jars by instinct. "Sit," she commanded, gesturing to the stool near her work table. He obeyed, lowering himself with the careful movement of someone whose body had betrayed him too many times to be trusted. Up close, Myling could see the fine lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair. This was a man who'd spent his life squinting into sun and wind. She gathered what she needed: golden seal root for the infection, comfrey for tissue healing, a tincture of echinacea for immune support. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, mixing and measuring, while the man sat silent on the stool. "This will hurt," she warned, approaching with a cloth soaked in her preparation. "Most things do," he replied, and there was something in his voice, not self-pity, but simple acknowledgement of a truth he'd long since accepted. Myling pressed the cloth to his wound. His body went rigid, every muscle tensing, but he didn't pull away. She held the cloth in place, counting silently to 30, watching his profile. He stared straight ahead at nothing, his breathing controlled, his hands gripped tight on his knees. When she finally removed the cloth, he released a breath he'd been holding. "You are strong," she said, and meant it. "No, ma'am. Just used to hurt." Something in those words resonated in the hollow spaces inside her chest. She turned away to prepare the salve he'd need to apply at home, aware of his presence behind her in a way that felt different from her usual customers, different in a way that made her nervous. "You have wife?" she asked, keeping her eyes on her work. "She can help apply this, twice daily." The silence that followed lasted too long. When he finally spoke, his voice had gone flat. "No wife. Not anymore." Myling's hands paused over the jar she was filling. She didn't need to ask. The tone told her everything, not divorced, not separated, gone. The same way was gone into that permanent darkness that swallowed people and never gave them back. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. 2 years back. Influenza. Took her and the baby both. Myling turned to look at him then. His face still held that careful blankness, but his eyes had gone somewhere else. Somewhere she recognized because she went there herself in the dark hours before dawn. "My husband," she offered, the words coming out before she could stop them. 18 months. Accident in the mine. Their eyes met, and in that moment, something passed between them that had no name. Not attraction. It was too raw for that. Not friendship, they were strangers, but recognition. The kind that happens when one broken thing sees another and understands the specific shape of its fracture. The man stood slowly, taking the jar she offered. "What do I owe you?" $2. He counted out the coins from a leather pouch, his hands scarred and calloused, the hands of someone who'd built his life from dirt and will. When he passed her the money, his fingers brushed hers accidentally, and Myling pulled back as if burned. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, pulling on his shirt with careful movements. "I'm Arthur Hayes. I run a cattle operation about 5 miles north of town, the Double H Ranch." She nodded, committing the name to memory, though she told herself it didn't matter. Myling Chen. "I know." He settled his hat back on his head. "Everyone knows. You're the woman who knows the old medicines. The one who fixes things doctors can't. Or won't, she added with a bitter edge. A ghost of something that might have been a smile touched his mouth. Or won't, he agreed. He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the frame. Mrs. Chen, thank you. Not just for the medicine, well, thank you. Then he was gone, the bell chiming his departure, leaving Mylene alone with the fading sound and the strange feeling that something had shifted in the careful isolation she'd built around herself. She told herself it meant nothing. He was a customer, nothing more. She'd see him once more when he returned for a refill of the salve, and then never again. That was how these things worked. She told herself this with the conviction of someone who desperately needed it to be true. But over the following week, Arthur Hayes returned to her thoughts with troubling frequency. She'd be grinding herbs and remember the stoic way he'd endured pain. She'd be measuring tinctures and recall the careful respect in how he'd removed his hat. She'd be eating her solitary dinner and wonder if he sat alone at his own table, chewing food that tasted like ashes because there was no one across from him to make it worth savoring. 10 days after his first visit, the bell chimed again. Milling looked up from the ledger she was updating. We had taught her to keep meticulous records, and felt her heart perform a small, traitorous leap. Arthur Hayes stood in the doorway, hat in hand again, snow-dusting his shoulders. Mr. Hayes, she said, proud that her voice remained steady. The wound, it is worse. No, ma'am, it's better. A lot better, actually. Best it's felt since the horse got me. He shifted his weight, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. I was hoping I might get some more of that salve, just to make sure it heals complete. Mylene studied him for a moment. The wound had been healing well when he'd left. She'd seen it in the healthy color of the tissue. He didn't need more salve. He'd come back anyway. Of course, she said slowly. I will prepare. As she moved to gather her supplies, she was aware of him watching her work, not with the impatience of her usual customers who wanted their remedies and to be gone, but with genuine interest. How did you learn all this? He asked. The medicines and such? My husband teach me. He learned from his father, who learned from his father. In my family village in China, we have apothecary for 200 years. Must be strange being so far from home. Mylene paused in her work. No one had ever asked her that. No one had ever seemed to care that she might have feelings about the vast distance between where she was and where she came from. Very strange, she admitted quietly. But my husband, he say we make new home here. America is land of opportunity, he say. She couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. He believed this until the day the mine collapsed on him. I'm sorry, Arthur said, and the words carried none of the performative sympathy she'd heard from townspeople who didn't mean it. That's a hard way to lose someone. Any way is hard way. True enough. She finished preparing the salve in silence, aware of the conversation hanging between them, unfinished. When she turned to hand him the jar, she found him standing closer than she'd expected. Not threateningly close, but close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, close enough to smell the cold winter air that clung to his coat. Mrs. Chen, he said quietly, I wonder if you might allow me to be honest with you. Her heart began beating faster. Honest about what? About why I really came back today. He met her eyes directly, and she saw something in them that made her breath catch. Vulnerability and courage mixed in equal measure. My shoulder's healing fine. Better than fine. I came back because in the 10 days since I was here last, I found myself thinking about this place. About our conversation, He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. About how it felt to talk to someone who understood. About loss. About being alone. Mylene took a step back, her mind racing. This was dangerous. This was everything she'd told herself couldn't happen. Shouldn't happen. Mr. Hayes, she began, but he held up a hand. I know what you're going to say. I know all the reasons this is improper. I'm not asking for anything, Mrs. Chen. I just wanted you to know that you're not... That is, I thought maybe you might also feel... He trailed off, looking more uncomfortable than he had with a wound that wouldn't heal. I'm making a mess of this. You should go, Mylene said, but her voice lacked conviction. I should, he agreed. But he didn't move. They stood there in the dim shop, snow falling outside the window, the world reduced to the small space between them. Mylene felt herself teetering on the edge of something vast and terrifying. For 18 months, she'd kept herself carefully numb, moving through her days like a woman walking underwater. The numbness was safe. The numbness protected her. But standing here, looking into Arthur Hayes' eyes, she felt the first crack in that protective ice. "I'm afraid," she whispered. "So am I," he replied. "But I'm more afraid of spending the rest of my life alone, talking to ghosts." The truth of his words hit her like a physical blow. Because wasn't that exactly what she'd been doing? Living with Wee's ghost, speaking to his memory, arranging her life around an absence? "I don't know what this is," Arthur continued, his voice low and earnest. "I don't know what it could be. All I know is that I've felt dead inside for 2 years. And then I walked into your shop, and for the first time since Mary passed, I felt something. Even if it's just the possibility of feeling something. That's got to mean something, doesn't it?" Mary. His wife had been named Mary. Mylene found herself wanting to know more. What she'd looked like, how they'd met, what her laugh had sounded like. But those questions felt too intimate, too much like permission for this impossible thing to continue. "The town," she said, grasping for the practical objections that might shield her from the emotional ones. "They will not accept. Chinese woman and white man, they will say terrible things." "Let them say," Arthur replied with sudden fierceness. "I've spent 2 years caring what people think, trying to be the grieving widower they expect, keeping my head down and my mouth shut. I'm tired, Mrs. Chen, tired of being what other people need me to be. But I am," she struggled for the word, "outsider. Not American, not white. They think I am strange, dangerous maybe. You're the least dangerous person I've ever met." He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his face, making her see the man he must have been before grief carved him into something harder. "You fix things, Mrs. Chen. You heal. If that makes you dangerous, then I reckon we need more dangerous people in the world." Despite herself, Mylene felt her own mouth curve into a smile. It felt strange on her face, unfamiliar, like a language she'd forgotten how to speak. "I should not smile," she said. "This is not proper." "Probably not," Arthur agreed. "But I'll be honest again. I don't much care about Proper anymore. Proper buried my wife and baby. Proper left me alone on a ranch with nothing but cows and silence. If Proper's all I've got to look forward to, I might as well dig my own grave now." The raw honesty in his words should have frightened her. Instead, it made something warm unfurl in her chest, something she'd thought had frozen to death alongside Wee. "What you want from me?" she asked directly, needing to understand. Arthur considered the question seriously. "I don't rightly know. Maybe just to see you again. To talk. To have someone who understands what it's like to live in a house full of memories that cut like broken glass every time you turn around." He paused. "Would that be all right, if I came by sometimes just to talk?" Every rational part of Mylene's mind screamed that she should say no, that she should send him away, lock the door, retreat back into the safe numbness of her grief. Anything else led to pain, to complications, to the town's judgment and her own vulnerability. But there was another part of her, a part she'd buried deep, that was so desperately tired of being alone. "You need reason," she said finally. "If you come just to talk, people will notice, will gossip." "Then I'll buy things," Arthur said immediately. "Remedies, herbs, whatever you've got. My ranch hands are always getting bunged up. I'll tell people I'm stocking up on supplies." It was a thin pretense, and they both knew it. But it was something. "Okay," Mylene heard herself say, the word escaping before caution could stop it. "You can come, but only in day, when shop is open. And you must always buy something." The smile that broke across Arthur's face was like sunrise after a long night. "Yes, ma'am. I'll buy you out if that's what it takes." He paid for the salve he didn't need and left with a promise to return in a few days. After the door closed behind him, Mylene stood alone in her shop, trembling slightly, wondering what she'd just agreed to. That night, for the first time in 18 months, she dreamed of something other than the moment they'd brought Wee's body up from the mine shaft. Arthur Hayes returned 3 days later, and then 4 days after that, and then with increasing frequency until his visits became a pattern, a rhythm that organized Meiling's weeks. He came with excuses, a request for liniment for sore muscles, a salve for rope burns, a tonic for one of his ranch hands who'd caught a cough. Meiling prepared what he asked for and pretended not to notice that the quantities he requested were far more than any small operation would need, but the remedies were just the admission price. What Arthur really came for was conversation. At first, they talked around the edges of things, the weather, the hard winter, the price of cattle, the challenges of running businesses alone. Safe topics that revealed nothing. But gradually, like ice thawing in spring, their conversations deepened. Arthur told her about the Double H Ranch, how he'd built it from nothing with Mary by his side, how she'd been as tough as any ranch hand, working cattle when she was 6 months pregnant, insisting that a baby didn't make her fragile, how the influenza had taken her so fast, so brutally, that he'd barely had time to understand she was sick before she was gone. The baby, we'd named him Thomas, after my father. He only lived 2 days after she passed, Arthur said one afternoon, his voice rough with old pain. Couldn't survive without her. I understood that. Some days I'm not sure how I'm surviving without her either. Meiling had reached across the counter then, surprising herself, and placed her hand over his. You survive because you must. Because stopping, that is only way they truly win. Death, I mean. If we stop, they take everything. If we keep going, we keep piece of them alive. Arthur had looked down at her small hand covering his larger one, and something had shifted in the air between them. She told him about about their arranged marriage when she was just 17, how she'd been terrified of this stranger who would become her husband, how had been patient and kind, teaching her not just the apothecary trade, but also how to read English, how to navigate this strange American world, how they'd saved for years to open the shop, dreaming of the life they'd build. He was good man, she said. Not romantic, not like in books, but good, steady. Like mountain, always there. Her voice broke slightly. Until mountain fall down. I'm sorry, Arthur said. That's a special kind of cruel, to find safety and then have it ripped away. These conversations happened in stolen moments between other customers. When the bell chimed and someone else entered, Arthur would step back, become just another patron, and Meiling would slip back into her role as the proprietor. But in the spaces between, they built something neither of them had names for. The town, of course, noticed. It started with sideways glances when Arthur's horse was tied outside the apothecary, then whispered conversations that stopped when Meiling walked past on the street. Then Mrs. Abernathy, the banker's wife, an unofficial arbiter of Sweetwater's morality, made a pointed visit to the shop. Mrs. Chen, she said, her smile sharp as a knife, I couldn't help but notice that Mr. Hayes seems to require an awful lot of medical attention lately. Meiling kept her face carefully neutral. Mr. Hayes run cattle ranch, many injuries on ranch. Indeed. It's just that some people, not me, of course, but some people, are beginning to talk about the propriety of a widower spending so much time in the shop of a widow, particularly a widow who is, well, different. The word hung in the air between them, loaded with everything it really meant. Foreign, Chinese. Not one of us. I sell medicine, Meiling said flatly. That is all. Of course. I'm sure that's all it is. Mrs. Abernathy's tone made it clear she believed no such thing. I'm simply suggesting that appearances matter in a town like Sweetwater. A woman in your position would be wise to be careful about appearances. After she left, Meiling stood trembling with anger and fear. Mrs. Abernathy was right, of course. Appearances did matter. And the appearance of what was happening between her and Arthur, however innocent it might be, would be enough to destroy what little acceptance she'd managed to carve out in this town. When Arthur came by the next day, she told him they needed to stop. Stop what? He asked, though his eyes said he knew exactly what. This, you coming here. It is causing talk. Let people talk. Easy for you to say, Meiling shot back, her fear making her sharp. You are white man, American, rancher, respected. I am foreign widow. If people turn against me, I lose shop, lose home, lose everything. You lose nothing. The words came out harsher than she'd intended, but they held a truth neither of them could deny. The stakes were not equal. They had never been equal. Arthur was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight with controlled emotion. "You're right. I hadn't thought about it that way. I was being selfish. I am sorry, sir." "No." He held up a hand. "Don't apologize for speaking truth. I came in here thinking only about what I needed, what I wanted. Didn't consider what it might cost you." He picked up his hat from the counter. "I'll stay away. But Mrs. Chen, Mylene?" It was the first time he'd used her given name, and it sent a shiver through her. "I want you to know that these weeks, getting to know you, talking with you, they've meant more to me than you can probably imagine. You gave me something I thought I'd lost. So, thank you for that." He turned to leave, and Mylene felt something in her chest tear open. She'd been protecting herself, doing the smart thing, the safe thing. So why did it feel like she was making the worst mistake of her life? "Arthur," she called out, and he stopped. "Wait." He turned back, and the hope in his eyes nearly undid her completely. "Maybe," she said carefully, "maybe you not come to shop, but maybe if you ride past on Sunday afternoon and I happen to be walking to the edge of town where the creek is, and we happen to meet there." She trailed off, hardly believing what she was suggesting. A slow smile spread across Arthur's face. "Sunday afternoons are good for riding. I often go out to check fence lines along the creek." "Creek is a good place for walking. Peaceful." "Peaceful," he agreed. "Nobody much goes there in winter." They looked at each other, and Mylene felt the weight of what they were really agreeing to. Not just secret meetings, but permission for this impossible thing between them to continue growing. "Sunday, then," Arthur said softly. "Sunday," she confirmed. That Sunday, Mylene walked to the creek with her heart hammering in her chest, half expecting Arthur not to come, half terrified that he would. When she saw him leading his horse along the frozen bank, something inside her both broke and healed at the same time. They walked together in the cold, their breath making clouds in the air, talking about everything and nothing. Without the constraints of the shop, without the possibility of interruption, their conversation flowed deeper. Arthur told her about his childhood in Ohio, about the father who'd taught him to work with his hands, about the dream of owning land that had brought him west. Mylene spoke of her village in Guangdong province, about the cherry trees that bloomed each spring, about the grandmother who'd first taught her to identify healing herbs. When it grew too cold to stay out longer, they parted reluctantly, Arthur heading north to his ranch, Mylene south back to town. They made no promises, no declarations. But the following Sunday, they were both there again. And the Sunday after that, and the one after that. Through the depths of January and into February, they built a ritual. Sunday afternoons by the creek, walking and talking, slowly discovering each other. Arthur learned that Mylene loved the poetry of Li Bai and could recite verses in Chinese that made the language sound like music. Mylene learned that Arthur played harmonica poorly but enthusiastically, and that he'd tried to teach himself from a book he'd ordered from a catalog. "Play for me," she demanded one afternoon. "I'm terrible," he protested, but he pulled the instrument from his pocket anyway. He was right. He was terrible. The notes came out reedy and off-key, and he lost his place twice in the simple melody. But Mylene found herself smiling, then laughing, and finally Arthur was laughing too, the sound of it echoing across the frozen creek. When was the last time she'd laughed like that? Not the polite smile she gave customers, but real laughter that came from somewhere deep and genuine. "You are very bad at harmonica," she said when she'd caught her breath. "I warned you," Arthur replied, grinning, "but I like it anyway. The badness makes it honest." Something in Arthur's expression shifted, became more serious. "Is that what we're being, Mylene? Honest?" The question hung between them, because they'd been skirting around the truth for weeks now, pretending these walks were just friendship between two lonely people. But friendship didn't make her pulse race when she saw him approaching. Friendship didn't make her count the hours until Sunday afternoon. Friendship didn't make her lie awake at night, remembering the way he said her name. "I don't know," she whispered. "I'm afraid to be honest. Afraid of what it mean." Arthur stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to see his face. "I'm afraid too. I'm afraid of wanting something I can't have. Afraid of caring about someone when I know how badly it hurts to lose them. Afraid of what people will say, what they'll do. He paused, his eyes searching hers. But I'm more afraid of walking away from you and spending the rest of my life wondering what if. Arthur, I'm not asking for anything, he said quickly. I know how complicated this is. I know all the reasons it can't work. I just need you to know that what I feel for you, it's real. It's not just loneliness or grief looking for a warm body to fill the empty space. You, Mylene Chen, are extraordinary. You're strong and smart and brave in ways I can't even begin to match. And somewhere along the way, I fell in love with you. The words should have terrified her. Instead, they unlocked something she'd been holding desperately closed. When we die, she said slowly, I think I die too. Inside. I think I will be dead person for rest of life, just walking and working, but not living. But then you come to my shop with hurt shoulder and sad eyes, and I think, this man understand. This man knows what it is to be ghost. She reached up and touched his face, her small hand against his cold, reddened cheek. And slowly, talking to you, seeing you, I feel something wake up. Something I think is gone forever. I am afraid of this feeling, but I have it anyway. What feeling? Arthur asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mylene took a breath, diving off the cliff. Love. I love you, Arthur Hayes, and it terrifies me. For a moment, they just stood there, the truth finally spoken, hanging in the frigid air between them. Then Arthur pulled her into his arms, and Mylene let herself be held, let herself feel safe in the circle of his embrace. What do we do now? She asked against his chest. I don't know, Arthur admitted, but we'll figure it out together. It was a promise neither of them knew if they could keep, but standing there in the winter cold, holding each other like lifelines, they chose to believe it. The thaw came early that year, or perhaps it only seemed that way to Mylene because the ice inside her had already begun to melt. By late February, the creek ran free again, its water dark and quick over stones that had been locked in frost for months. The sound of it filled the Sunday silences between her and Arthur, a constant murmur that seemed to speak of movement, of change, of things long frozen finally breaking free. They were careful, painfully, meticulously careful. Arthur varied the times of his rides, sometimes coming early in the afternoon, sometimes near dusk. Mylene took different routes to the creek, sometimes from the north, sometimes circling wide from the east. They never stayed longer than an hour. They never touched where anyone might see, though the restraint cost them both. But caution, they would learn, was no match for a small town's hunger for scandal. It was Mrs. Patterson's youngest boy who saw them first. Timothy Patterson, all of 8 years old, had been tracking a rabbit through the cottonwoods along the creek when he stumbled upon them. Arthur and Mylene were sitting on a fallen log, close but not touching, their heads bent together as Mylene tried to teach Arthur a simple Chinese phrase. Wo ai ni, she said, the word soft in the winter air. It means, I know what it means, Arthur interrupted gently. I asked old Chen at the railroad camp. I wanted to be able to say it proper. Mylene's breath caught. You went to railroad camp? But those men, they will talk. They won't. I told them I was trying to learn enough Chinese to do business with the merchants in Rock Springs. Chen's a good man. He taught me a few phrases, didn't ask questions I couldn't answer. Arthur's eyes met hers. Wo ai ni, mealing. The words, shaped by his American mouth, came out clumsy and accented, but they were the most beautiful things she'd ever heard. She was reaching for his hand, propriety forgotten, when a twig snapped in the underbrush. They sprang apart like guilty children, but not before Timothy Patterson got a good long look. The boy crashed back through the brush, rabbit forgotten, running for home with news that would be worth at least 2 pieces of his mother's apple pie. By Monday morning, half the town knew that Arthur Hayes and the Chinese widow had been seen together by the creek. By Monday afternoon, the other half knew too, and the story had grown in the telling. They'd been holding hands, no, embracing, no, kissing passionately like characters in one of those dime novels Mrs. Abernathy pretended she didn't read. The first sign of trouble came when Mylene opened her shop Monday morning to find the word whore painted across her door in crude white letters. She stood staring at it for a long moment, her medical bag heavy in her hand, feeling something cold and hard settle in her stomach. She'd known this was a possibility, had known it from the moment she'd agreed to meet Arthur by the creek, but knowing and experiencing were different countries entirely. With shaking hands, she mixed a solution of lye soap and water and scrubbed at the paint until her knuckles were raw and bleeding. The letters faded but didn't disappear completely, leaving ghost words that anyone who looked closely enough could still read. Inside, she tried to lose herself in work. She had orders to fill. Mrs. Kowalski needed her rheumatism tonic, old Mr. Brennan was almost out of his heart medication, and she'd promised young Sarah Mitchell a salve for her baby's cradle cap. Normal things. The ordinary rhythms of her life. But when the bell chimed and Mrs. Kowalski came in for her tonic, the woman's usual friendly chatter had been replaced by a cold silence. She took her bottle, paid exact change, and left without meeting Mylene's eyes. Mr. Brennan didn't come at all. Instead, his son appeared, a hard-faced man in his 30s who'd never set foot in the shop before. "My father won't be needing your services anymore," he said without preamble. "He'll be getting his medicine from Doc Pritchard from now on." "But Doc Pritchard cannot make—" "Don't much matter what he can or can't make. What matters is keeping proper company." The younger Brennan's eyes were cold. "You do well to remember your place here, Mrs. Chen. You're here on sufferance, and sufferance can be withdrawn." After he left, Mylene sat down hard on her stool, her hands trembling. "Your place." As if she were a piece of furniture that could be moved or removed at the town's convenience. As if the 4 years she'd spent here, the dozens of people she'd helped, the life she'd built meant nothing against the crime of being seen with a white man. The bell chimed again, and Mylene looked up to find Sarah Mitchell in the doorway, her baby on her hip. The young woman looked nervous, glancing over her shoulder as if afraid of being followed. "Mrs. Chen, Sarah started, then stopped. "I'm sorry. My husband says I can't come here anymore. Says it's not proper, given the talk." She shifted the baby, who was fussing and red-faced. "But Bethy's rash is so much better with your salve, and nothing else works, and I just thought—" "Is okay," Mylene interrupted, her heart aching for this frightened young mother. She quickly prepared a jar of salve and pressed it into Sarah's free hand. "You take. No charge." "I can't." "You take," Mylene repeated firmly. "Baby needs medicine. That is more important than talk." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you. And Mrs. Chen? I don't believe what they're saying about you. I think you're a good woman who deserves better than this town gives you." After Sarah hurried out, clutching the salve like contraband, Mylene allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to sit with her head in her hands, letting the fear and anger wash through her. Then she stood up, straightened her spine, and went back to work. She would not be driven out. Not by paint on her door, not by whispers, not by the withdrawal of custom. She had survived her husband's death, had survived being alone in a foreign land. She would survive this too. But the question that haunted her as she ground herbs and mixed tinctures was whether Arthur could survive what loving her would cost him. She got her answer that evening when Sheriff Brody appeared at her door just as she was closing up. Thomas Brody was a thick-bodied man in his 50s, with a face like weathered leather and eyes that revealed nothing. He'd been sheriff of Sweetwater for 15 years, dispensing rough justice with an even hand. He'd never been particularly friendly to Mylene, but he'd never been hostile either. She existed in his world as a necessary oddity, like the telegraph office or the Wells Fargo station. Now, standing in her doorway with his hat in his hands, he looked uncomfortable. "Mrs. Chen," he said, "mind if I come in?" It wasn't really a question. Mylene stepped aside, her heart hammering. Brody looked around the shop, his gaze moving over the jars and bottles, the bundles of dried herbs, the mysterious tools of her trade. "Quite an operation you've got here. Your husband built it up from nothing, I understand." "Yes, we work very hard. I'm sure he did." Brody turned to face her. "Mrs. Chen, I'm going to be straight with you because I think you're a reasonable woman. There's been talk about you and Arthur Hayes. Mr. Hayes is customer. He buy medicine for ranch. I'm sure he does. But see, here's the thing. It doesn't much matter what the truth is. What matters is what people believe. And right now, people believe you two are... He paused, searching for a delicate phrase. Keeping company in a way that's not appropriate. Mylene lifted her chin. And if we are? Is not against law for widow and widower to talk. No, ma'am, it's not. But you're not just any widow, are you? You're Chinese. And Hayes is a respected rancher, a white man. Those things matter in a town like this. So Chinese woman cannot... I'm not saying it's right, Brody interrupted, his voice taking on an edge. I'm saying it's how it is. Now, I've known Arthur Hayes for near about 12 years. He's a good man who's had a hard time of it, lost his wife and baby, been living alone ever since. I'd hate to see him make a mistake that would ruin him. Ruin him? Mylene's voice shook with barely controlled anger. How I ruin him? I teach him nothing bad. I hurt no one. You don't understand how these things work. If Hayes keeps seeing you, keeps defending you, people will turn on him. They'll stop doing business with him. They'll make his life here impossible. Is that what you want? The worst part was that Brody wasn't being cruel. He was being practical, laying out the mathematics of prejudice like a ledger sheet. One Chinese widow minus one white rancher equals social destruction. It was that simple. What you want me to do? Mylene asked quietly. Tell him to stay away. Make it clear there's nothing between you. Let things settle down. Brody put his hat back on. You seem like a sensible woman, Mrs. Chen. I'm hoping you'll do the sensible thing. After he left, Mylene locked the door and climbed the narrow stairs to the small apartment above the shop where she lived. The rooms were spare but clean, decorated with the few things she'd brought from China: a carved jade figurine of Guanyin, a silk scroll with a painting of mountains, a photograph of her parents taken before she'd left for America. She sat on her bed, still wearing her coat, and stared at the photograph. Her mother's face was stern in the picture, her father's dignified. What would they think of their daughter now, caught between love and ruin in this cold American town? The knock on the door downstairs came an hour later. Mylene knew without looking that it would be Arthur. She'd been expecting him, dreading him, needing him. She went down and opened the door, pulling him quickly inside before anyone could see. It's all over town, Arthur said without preamble. His face was tight with anger. I've had 3 different people come up to me today with their opinions about my private business. Doc Pritchard actually had the nerve to suggest I was being led astray by Oriental wiles. He spat the words like poison. Oriental wiles, as if you were some kind of sorceress instead of a woman who mixes herbs for a living. Arthur, and Sheriff Brody stopped by my ranch this afternoon, wanted to have a friendly conversation about appropriate behavior and community standards. Friendly? Arthur laughed bitterly. There was nothing friendly about it. It was a warning, plain and simple. He come here too, Mylene said quietly. He say I should tell you to stay away, say I will ruin you if I don't. Arthur's jaw clenched. That's not his decision to make, or anyone else's. But maybe he is right. The words cost her everything to say. Maybe this, us, is too dangerous. You are an important man here, Arthur. You have business, land, future. I am just... Don't! Arthur crossed the room in 2 strides, taking her shoulders gently in his hands. Don't you dare say you're just anything. You're not just a widow, not just Chinese, not just anything. You're Mylene Chen. You're brilliant and brave, and you've survived things that would have broken most people. You matter, Mylene. Not just to me, but in yourself. But the cost, I don't care about the cost. His eyes blazed with a fierce determination she'd never seen before. Do you hear me? I don't care if they stop buying my cattle. I don't care if they run me out of town. I've been dead inside for 2 years, going through the motions of living without actually being alive. You brought me back, Mylene. You made me remember what it feels like to want something, to care about something beyond just surviving another day. How can I give that up? How can you ask me to? Mylene felt tears spilling down her cheeks. Because I am afraid. I am so afraid, Arthur. Afraid they will hurt you. Afraid they will destroy everything you build. Afraid that loving me will cost you everything. And I'm afraid that walking away from you will cost me the only thing that actually matters. He pulled her close, and she went into his arms, breathing in the scent of him, leather and soap, and the sharp, clean smell of winter air. We can leave, Mylene, both of us. We can go somewhere where people don't know us, where we can start fresh. The offer hung between them, tempting and terrible, to run away together, to escape the judgment and the whispers. But Mylene knew what running would cost. This shop was all she had left of of the life they'd built together. And Arthur's ranch was his legacy, built with his own hands and his wife's memory. "We cannot run," she whispered. "Running means they win, means we let fear decide our life." "Then what do we do?" Mylene pulled back enough to look up at him. "We be careful. We be smart. We give them nothing to talk about for a while. Let things quiet down." "You mean stop seeing each other?" "I mean be more careful about how we see each other." She took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "I'm not ready to give you up, Arthur Hayes, but I'm also not ready to watch them destroy you because of me." Arthur was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "All right, Mom," he said finally. "We'll be careful. But Mylene, this doesn't end. I won't let it end. We'll find a way." "Promise?" "I promise." They stood there in her darkened shop, holding each other while the world outside pressed in with its judgments and its fears. And for that moment, it was enough to simply be together, to feel the solid reality of each other's presence against the uncertainty of everything else. When Arthur finally left, slipping out the back door into the alley like a thief, Mylene climbed back to her apartment and lay awake in the darkness. She thought about courage and cowardice, about love and survival, about all the impossible choices that came with being a woman, a foreigner, someone who existed outside the neat lines the world drew around acceptable behavior. Somewhere in the hours before dawn, she made a decision. She would not be driven away. She would not let fear dictate her life. But she would also not be reckless with Arthur's future. There had to be a middle path, a way to navigate between complete surrender and total defiance. She just had to find it. The next few weeks were an exercise in restraint that left them both raw. Arthur stayed away from the shop entirely, and their Sunday meetings by the creek ceased. But he was clever, Arthur. He found ways. A package arrived at Mylene's door, delivered by a boy who clearly had no idea what he was carrying. Inside was a book, a collection of poetry by Walt Whitman, with a note tucked between the pages in Arthur's careful handwriting. "Because you said you wanted to understand American poetry, and because page 47 made me think of you." Mylene turned to page 47 and found a poem about grass, about life continuing despite death, about the eternal cycle of loss and renewal. She read it 3 times, then pressed the note to her chest and allowed herself to cry. She sent a reply through the same boy, a small packet of tea, the expensive kind she saved for herself, with her own note. "Because you said coffee was all you drank. Try this instead. It is called Tai Guan Yin, Iron Goddess of Mercy. She brings peace to troubled hearts." A few days later, another package. This time, a harmonica. A good one, not the battered instrument he'd been teaching himself on. "So you can play something beautiful instead of just listening to my terrible attempts," his note read, "though I confess I miss making you laugh with my awfulness." They couldn't touch, couldn't speak, couldn't meet. But through these small gifts, these tiny gestures of connection, they kept the thread between them alive. It wasn't enough. It could never be enough. But it was something. Mylene threw herself into her work with renewed intensity. If the townspeople wanted to judge her, let them. She would prove herself indispensable. She expanded her inventory, working late into the night to prepare remedies she'd never offered before. She studied her husband's old books, teaching herself treatments she'd only half understood before. And slowly, grudgingly, people began to return. Not everyone. Mrs. Kowalski still walked past the shop with her nose in the air, and the Brennans were lost to her forever. But others came back, drawn by necessity, if not acceptance. A sprained ankle that wouldn't heal, a cough that Doc Pritchard's medicines couldn't touch, a woman's problem that couldn't be spoken of to a male doctor. Mylene treated them all with the same professional courtesy, asking no questions, accepting no apologies. When Mrs. Hendricks came in sheepishly, 3 weeks after swearing she'd never darken the door again, Mylene simply asked, "What you need today?" "My joints," Mrs. Hendricks admitted. The pain's something fierce, and nothing Doc gives me touches it. I know I said some things, Mrs. Chen, things I shouldn't have. You need medicine for joint pain, Mylene interrupted. That is all that matters now. Sit. I will prepare. Word spread. The Chinese woman didn't hold grudges. She just healed, like it was the only thing that mattered. And maybe, some people began to think, they'd been too quick to judge. But acceptance was a fragile thing, and it shattered the night Marcus Webb came home drunk and angry. Webb was a ranch hand who worked for John Parsons, a rancher whose spread bordered Arthur's property to the east. Webb had a reputation for meanness when he drank, and on this particular March night, he'd been drinking since noon. He'd also been nursing a grudge against Arthur Hayes ever since Arthur had outbid him on a piece of grazing land the previous summer. In his whiskey-addled mind, the stories about Arthur and the Chinese widow crystallized into a plan for revenge. Mylene was in her apartment reading by lamplight when she heard the crash downstairs. She froze, the book falling from her hands. Another crash, the sound of breaking glass. Then a man's voice, slurred and hateful. "Come on out, China doll. I know you're up there." Terror flooded through her, cold and sharp. She moved to the door, pressed her ear against it. More crashes from below, the systematic destruction of her shop. Hayes thinks he's too good for a white woman, has to go sniffing after yellow tail? Let's see if you're worth all the trouble. Mylene's hands shook as she pushed her small dresser in front of the door. It wouldn't stop him, not really, but it might slow him down. She looked around desperately for a weapon, settling on the heavy brass candlestick from her bedside table. The footsteps on the stairs were uneven, stumbling. "I'm coming for you, sweetheart. Gonna show you what a real American man is like." The door shook as Webb threw his weight against it. Once. Twice. The dresser scraped across the floor. Mylene backed against the far wall, the candlestick raised, her heart slamming against her ribs. The door burst open, the dresser toppling. Marcus Webb stood in the doorway, a big man gone to fat, his face red and gleaming with sweat. He grinned when he saw her. "There you are. Been wondering what Hayes sees in you. Let's find out." He lunged toward her, and Mylene swung the candlestick with all her strength. It connected with his shoulder. She'd been aiming for his head, but he'd moved, and he roared with pain and rage. "You little—" He grabbed for her, and Mylene screamed. It was a sound she didn't recognize coming from her own throat, primal and terrified. She swung again, and this time she didn't miss. The candlestick caught Webb across the temple, and he went down hard, blood streaming from his scalp. For a horrible moment, Mylene thought she'd killed him. Then he groaned and rolled onto his side, and she could see his chest rising and falling. She didn't wait, didn't stop to check how badly he was hurt. She grabbed her coat and ran, her bare feet slipping on the stairs, her breath coming in panicked gasps. The shop was destroyed, jars broken, herbs scattered, her careful inventory reduced to chaos. But she didn't stop to look, didn't stop for anything. She just ran out into the night, toward the only place she could think of, toward Arthur. The 5 miles to the Double H Ranch might as well have been 50. She'd stolen a horse from behind the boarding house. She'd ask forgiveness later if there was a later, but she'd never been a confident rider. The animal sensed her fear and shied at shadows, and twice she nearly fell. But terror drove her on. Terror and the knowledge that if Webb came to and found her gone, he'd come looking, and next time she might not be able to fight him off. The lights of Arthur's ranch house appeared like salvation. She slid off the horse, stumbling, and ran to the door. Her fists pounded against the wood. "Arthur! Arthur, please!" The door flew open, and he was there, hair mussed from sleep, pulling on his shirt. His eyes widened when he saw her, bare feet bleeding, coat thrown over her nightgown, hair loose and wild around her shoulders. "Mylene, what? Man attack me," she gasped out. "Webb. He break into shop. He try to— I hit him. I run. Arthur, I am so sorry. I did not know where else." Arthur pulled her inside and kicked the door shut. "You're safe now. You're safe." He held her while she shook, his arms strong and steady around her. "Did he hurt you? Mylene, did he—" "No, I hit him with candlestick. He fall down. I don't know if he is dead." "Good. I hope you killed the bastard." Arthur's voice was hard as stone. "Stay here. I'm getting Sheriff Brody." "No!" Mylene grabbed his arm. "You cannot. They will not believe me." "Chinese woman hurt white man?" They will say, I attack him. They'll say the truth. That Marcus Webb broke into your home and tried to assault you, and you defended yourself. Arthur cupped her face in his hands. I won't let them hurt you, Mylene. I swear it. But when Sheriff Brody arrived with 2 deputies, the first thing he did was look at Mylene with suspicion rather than concern. Mrs. Chen says Marcus Webb attacked her, Arthur said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. Broke into her shop and went after her in her own rooms. That's so. Brody's eyes moved over Mylene's disheveled state, and she saw the calculation in them. Webb's over at Doc Pritchard's now. Got a nasty gash on his head, might have a concussion. Says he went to the apothecary to buy some whiskey cure, and the Chinese woman attacked him without provocation. That's a lie, and you know it, Arthur snapped. Webb was drunk, probably been drinking all day. He targeted Mylene because of the rumors about her and me. This is exactly what I was afraid would happen. Now, Hayes, I understand you're protective of Mrs. Chen, given your friendship, but we need to look at the facts here. Webb's a white man with a head injury. Mrs. Chen's a foreigner who admits to striking him. That's assault, by any measure. The words hit Mylene like a physical blow. After everything, after being attacked in her own home, after fighting for her life, she was the one being accused. Assault? Arthur's voice rose. He broke into her home. He destroyed her shop. He tried to rape her. She says, one of the deputies interjected, but we only got her word for that. My word not enough? Mylene heard herself say, her voice small and distant. Because I am Chinese, my word is nothing? The silence that followed was answer enough. Arthur's face had gone white with rage. If you arrest her, Tom, you'll have to arrest me too, because I'll tear that damn jail apart brick by brick. Don't make threats you can't back up, Hayes. It's not a threat. It's a promise. Sheriff Brody sighed, looking tired. I'm not arresting anyone tonight. But Mrs. Chen, you can't go back to your shop. Not until we sort this out. And Hayes, having her stay here would just make things worse for both of you. Then where? Arthur started, but Brody held up a hand. I'll take her to the boarding house. Mrs. Mackenzie's a decent woman. She'll give her a room for the night. Tomorrow, we'll figure out what's what. And so Mylene found herself being led away from Arthur's ranch, away from the first place she'd felt safe in hours, to a room at Mrs. Mackenzie's boarding house. The older woman was kind enough, offering tea and blankets without questions, but Mylene could see the curiosity in her eyes, the judgment forming. Alone in the small, cold room, Mylene finally let herself fall apart. Great! Shaking sobs tore through her, born of fear and exhaustion, and the terrible understanding that no matter what she did, no matter how careful she was, this town would never let her belong. And loving Arthur Hayes might cost them both everything. Morning came too soon and brought with it a reckoning. Mylene had spent the sleepless hours dreading. Sheriff Brody appeared at the boarding house just after dawn, his face grim in the weak spring light. Mrs. Mackenzie hovered in the hallway as he knocked on Mylene's door, her curiosity barely masked by a performance of concern. Mrs. Chen, Brody said when she opened the door, we need to talk about what happens next. Mylene had already dressed, her hair pulled back in its customary bun, her face carefully composed despite the exhaustion that made her bones ache. She would not let them see her broken. What you decide. Doc Pritchard says Webb's got a concussion, but he'll live. Webb's still claiming you attacked him without cause, but Brody shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable. Well, I went by your shop this morning, saw the damage. That's not the work of a man who just wanted to buy a remedy. Something flickered in Mylene's chest. Hope, perhaps, or the ghost of it. So you believe me? I believe something happened that scared you enough to crack a man's skull and run 5 miles in the dark. Brody's eyes were shrewd. But believing you and being able to do something about it are different things. Webb's got friends in this town. You're Chinese, Mylene finished flatly. You can say the word, Sheriff. I know what I am. It's not about what you are. It's about what people will accept. If I charge Webb with attempted assault, it becomes your word against his. A jury of white men deciding between a ranch hand they've known for years and a foreign widow most of them don't trust. How do you think that ends? Mylene looked down at her hands, still bearing cuts from the broken glass she'd run through in her escape. So he walks free. He destroys my shop, attacks me, and nothing happens to him. I didn't say that. Brody pulled out a chair from the small table and sat, gesturing for her to do the same. Here's what I'm proposing. Webb pays for the damages to your shop. Every broken jar, every lost remedy. And he stays away from you. I'll make sure he understands that part real clear. In exchange, you don't press charges. And if I say no, if I want justice? Brody's expression was almost sympathetic. Then we go through a trial that'll drag your name through mud you'll never wash off. They'll bring up every moment you've spent with Arthur Hayes, twist it into something ugly. And in the end, Webb will probably walk anyway, and you'll be the one who can't show your face in this town. The terrible thing was, he was right. Mealing could see the calculation clearly. Justice was a luxury afforded to those who belonged, and she had never belonged here. Would never belong. Fine, she said, the word tasting like ash. He pays for damages. But I want it in writing, Sheriff. I want document that says he admits to destroying my property. I can do that. And I want to go back to my shop, today. I have customers who need medicine. I have work. Brody hesitated. Mrs. Chen, given the state of things, I need to work even more. You think I have money saved for situations like this? You think I can afford to close my shop while people whisper about whether I am victim or villain? Mealing's voice hardened. I go back today, or I go to newspaper and tell them everything. About Webb, about how your justice works different for different people. Let them print that. It was a bluff. The newspaper editor, Mr. Harrison, had made his opinions about Chinese immigrants abundantly clear in numerous editorials. But Brody didn't need to know that. The sheriff studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, but you're not going alone. I'll have Deputy Morrison escort you, help you clean up. And Mrs. Chen, you might want to think about whether staying in Sweetwater is the wisest course. There are other towns, places where you could start fresh. Why should I leave? I did nothing wrong. Sometimes doing nothing wrong isn't enough. Brody stood, settling his hat back on his head. I'll have Morrison meet you at the shop in an hour. After he left, Myling sat alone in the small room, staring at the water stains on the ceiling and feeling the weight of impossible choices pressing down on her. She could leave, as Brody suggested, take what little she could salvage and disappear to some other town where no one knew her story. But running meant letting them win, meant accepting that her life was worth less than their prejudices, and it meant leaving Arthur. As if summoned by her thoughts, there was a soft knock at the door. Mrs. Mackenzie's voice came through, carefully neutral. Mrs. Chen, you have a visitor. Mr. Hayes is downstairs. Myling's heart lurched. She shouldn't see him, not here where Mrs. Mackenzie and anyone passing by could witness and report. But she needed to see him, needed it like air. She found Arthur in the boarding house parlor, turning his hat in his hands, his face drawn with worry and sleeplessness. When he saw her, he took a half step forward, then checked himself, aware of Mrs. Mackenzie hovering in the doorway. Mrs. Chen, he said formally, I wanted to check that you were all right, and to tell you I've spoken with Sheriff Brody about the damages to your shop. I know, he was here. Myling stayed carefully distant, maintaining the space that propriety demanded, even as everything in her wanted to close it. He says Webb will pay. Not enough, Arthur said, his voice tight with anger. Not nearly enough for what he did. But I've also told Brody that if Webb so much as looks at you wrong, I'll deal with him myself. Arthur, you cannot. I can and I will. His eyes blazed. I won't stand by and let people hurt you because we care about each other. I'm done with that. Mrs. Mackenzie cleared her throat pointedly from the doorway. I'll just be in the kitchen if you need anything, Mrs. Chen. Door stays open, mind. After she left, Arthur lowered his voice. I'm coming with you to the shop. I'll help you clean up, help you rebuild. I don't care what people say. That is exactly what we should care about. Myling moved closer, keeping her voice equally low. You heard what sheriff say. If we keep this up, they will destroy us both. Maybe it is better if we don't. Arthur's voice cracked. Don't say it, Myling. Don't tell me we should stop seeing each other because I can't do it. I can't go back to living half alive. But if loving me costs you everything, then let it cost everything. His vehemence startled them both. He took a breath, visibly fighting for control. I've been thinking about this all night, about what matters, what I'm willing to lose. And the answer is that I can lose the ranch, the respect of this town, every damn thing I own. What I can't lose is you. What I can't lose is the man I am when I'm with you. Mylene felt tears burning behind her eyes. You say that now. But when it is real, when they actually take it all away, then we'll leave, both of us. I'll sell the ranch, you close the shop, and we go somewhere we can just be Arthur and Mylene. Not white man and Chinese woman, not rancher and apothecary, just two people who found each other in the wreckage. It was a beautiful dream, and Mylene wanted desperately to believe in it. But she'd learned the hard way that dreams had a habit of curdling into nightmares when exposed to daylight. Let me think, she said quietly. Let me see my shop, see what can be saved. Then we talk about future. Promise me you'll think about it, about leaving together. I promise. The walk back to her shop felt like a funeral procession. Deputy Morrison met them there as promised, a young man who looked uncomfortable with his assignment. The damage was worse in daylight. The front window was shattered, letting in the March wind. Glass crunched under their feet, mixed with herbs and spilled tinctures that made the floor a treacherous soup of broken dreams. Webb had been thorough in his destruction. Jars smashed, shelves overturned, the careful organization of 4 years reduced to chaos. Even Wee's old ledgers had been torn apart, pages scattered like dead leaves. Mylene stood in the center of the destruction and felt something break inside her that had nothing to do with glass or furniture. This place had been her sanctuary, her last connection to the life she'd built with her husband. And they'd violated it, torn it apart because she dared to want something for herself. I'll get brooms, Morrison said awkwardly, and maybe some boards for that window. After he left, Arthur moved to stand beside her. We can fix this. It looks bad, but it's mostly just mess. The important things, your medicines, your knowledge, that's all still here. Is it? Mylene bent to pick up a jade figurine that had somehow survived the destruction. Guanyin, the goddess of mercy, stared up at her with serene eyes. Or is this sign that I should not be here? That I should take your offer and go? Only if that's what you truly want, not because you're scared, but because you choose it. Before Mylene could answer, the bell over the door chimed, the sound incongruous in the wreckage. She looked up to find Sarah Mitchell standing in the doorway, her baby on her hip, her eyes wide with shock. Mrs. Chen, I heard what happened. I had to come see if you were all right. I am fine. Thank you for— No, you're not fine. None of this is fine. Sarah's voice shook with emotion. I heard the women talking at the dry goods store this morning. Heard them saying you probably led Webb on, that you brought this on yourself by keeping company with Mr. Hayes. And I couldn't stay quiet anymore. Sarah, you should not involve yourself. I told them they were wrong, Sarah continued, her words tumbling out in a rush. I told them you were the kindest, most decent person in this town, and if they couldn't see that, the fault was theirs, not yours. I told them about how you gave me medicine for Bethy when my husband said I couldn't come here anymore. How you didn't ask for payment or throw our prejudice back in our faces. I told them the truth. Mylene felt her throat tighten. What'd they say to that? Mrs. Abernathy said I was young and didn't understand how the world worked. Mrs. Kowalski said I'd feel different when I was older and wiser. Sarah's eyes flashed with anger. But then Mrs. Patterson spoke up. You know, Timothy's mother? She said her boy told her what he saw by the creek, and all he saw was two people talking, not doing anything improper, just talking. She said maybe we'd all been too quick to judge. One woman's voice won't change much, Arthur said, but Mylene could hear the hope threading through his skepticism. Maybe not one, but then Mrs. Chen, no relation to you, the one who runs the laundry, she said you'd helped her daughter when she had the fever last year, didn't charge extra even though it was Chinese New Year, and you should have been closed. And old Mrs. Brennan, the elder Mr. Brennan's wife, she said her husband's heart medicine from Doc Pritchard cost 3 times what yours did and didn't work half as well. Sarah shifted the baby, her expression fierce. I'm not saying everyone agrees, plenty still think terrible things, but some of us know better, some of us see you. After Sarah left, promising to return later with help cleaning up, Mylene turned to Arthur with wonder and confusion warring in her chest. I do not understand. People hate me yesterday. Today, Some defend me? Not everyone's the same kind of person, Arthur said. Some folks need permission to be decent. Maybe what happened with Webb was bad enough that it gave the decent ones permission to speak up. Deputy Morrison returned with brooms and boards, and they set to work. Arthur proved surprisingly efficient at cleaning, sweeping broken glass into neat piles while Myling salvaged what she could from the wreckage. Many of her prepared remedies were lost, but the raw materials, the dried herbs, the roots and barks, most of those had survived in their sealed containers. They were working in focused silence when the door opened again. This time it was John Parsons, the rancher who employed Marcus Webb. He stood in the doorway, his weathered face unreadable. "Mrs. Chen," he said, removing his hat. "Mr. Hayes." Arthur straightened, his body tensing. "Parsons, I came to apologize." The words seemed to cost Parsons considerable effort. "Webb works for me, which makes his actions partly my responsibility. I should have sent him packing months ago. He's been nothing but trouble since the day I hired him. What he did here, what he tried to do to you, Mrs. Chen, there's no excuse for it." Myling studied him warily. "Sheriff says he will pay for damage." "He'll pay, and then some. I'm letting him go soon as Doc Pritchard clears him. Man who'd do something like this has no place on my ranch." Parsons turned his hat in his hands, looking uncomfortable. "I know an apology doesn't fix what happened, but I wanted you to hear it directly, and to let you know that if you need anything, lumber, labor, whatever, you let me know." After he left, Arthur let out a long breath. "Well, didn't expect that." "Neither did I." Myling looked around her destroyed shop with new eyes. Maybe, just maybe, not everyone had turned against her. Maybe there were more people willing to see her as human than she'd thought. Over the next 3 days, Myling discovered just how true that was. Help arrived in unexpected forms. Mrs. Chen from the laundry came with her 3 daughters, all of them armed with rags and buckets. They scrubbed the floors until the smell of broken tinctures faded, replaced by the clean scent of lye soap. Mr. Kowalski, the carpenter whose wife still refused to speak to Myling, appeared with new shelves and refused payment. "My wife and I don't see eye to eye on everything," was all he said. Even Doc Pritchard made a grudging appearance, bringing with him a bottle of antiseptic. "For your cuts," he said gruffly, gesturing to Myling's bandaged hands. "And because even though we're competitors, what happened to you was wrong. Man's got a right to his business without having it torn apart by drunk fools." But the most surprising help came from an unexpected source. On the 3rd day of repairs, a carriage pulled up outside the shop, fine enough to draw stares from passers-by. Out stepped Eleanor Winters, the mayor's wife, a woman Myling had seen only from a distance at town gatherings she was never invited to attend. Mrs. Winters was in her 50s, dressed in the kind of elegant but practical clothing that spoke of money tempered by frontier sensibility. She surveyed the shop with sharp blue eyes, then turned her attention to Myling. "Mrs. Chen, I'm Eleanor Winters." "I know who you are, Mrs. Winters." Myling wiped her dusty hands on her apron, suddenly conscious of how she must look, sweaty, disheveled, wearing work clothes instead of anything approaching respectability. "Then you probably wonder why I'm here." Mrs. Winters didn't wait for an invitation, simply walked into the shop and began examining the repairs. "I'll be direct. My husband is the mayor, which means I hear everything that happens in this town. And what I've heard about you, Mrs. Chen, has troubled me greatly." Myling's heart sank. Here it came, the polite but firm suggestion that she leave town for everyone's good. But Mrs. Winters surprised her. "Not troubled because I believe the gossip. Troubled because I've seen this pattern before. A woman, particularly one who's different, dares to step outside the narrow lines this town draws. And suddenly, she's the villain in everyone's story." She turned to face Myling directly. "My first husband was half Cheyenne. Do you know what they called me when I married him? The names, the assumptions? They said I'd been captured, that I'd lost my mind, that I was betraying my race." Myling stared at her speechless. "He died in a ranching accident 10 years ago. When I married Charles Winters 5 years later, a respectable white banker who became mayor, suddenly I was acceptable again, as if my worthiness had changed with my husband's bloodline." Mrs. Winters' voice was edged with old anger. So when I hear about a Chinese widow and a white rancher caring for each other, and the town losing their collective minds over it, forgive me if I see history repeating itself. I do not know what to say. You don't need to say anything. I came here to tell you that you have my support, and more importantly, you have my husband's support. Charles may be mayor, but I make sure he has the right opinions. A slight smile crossed her face. He'll be making it clear at the next town council meeting that harassment of business owners will not be tolerated, regardless of their origins. Why you help me? You do not know me. Because I know what it's like to love someone this town thinks you shouldn't, and because 20 years ago when I needed someone to stand up for me, no one did. I won't make that same mistake with you. Mrs. Winters moved toward the door, then paused. One more thing, Mrs. Chen, about Arthur Hayes. If you love him, don't let fear stop you. Fear is how they win. Love is how you survive. After she left, Mylene sat down hard on one of the newly repaired stools, her mind reeling. The world she'd thought she understood, where she was universally unwanted, universally judged, was revealing itself to be more complex. There were allies here, people who saw past skin color and origin to the human beneath. Not everyone, maybe not even most, but some. And maybe some was enough. When Arthur came by that evening, openly now, no longer trying to hide his visits, she told him about Mrs. Winters' visit. Eleanor Winters came here? He looked stunned. That woman doesn't leave her house without a reason. She says she understands that her first husband was half Cheyenne. Arthur whistled low. I'd heard rumors about that, but most folks don't talk about it anymore. Winters has money and power, so people forget what they want to forget. She says we should not let fear stop us. Mylene met his eyes. She says love is how we survive. Smart woman. Arthur took her hands, his thumbs tracing over the healing cuts. What do you think? About what she said? Mylene had spent 3 days thinking about little else, thinking about what it meant to live in fear versus living in truth, thinking about about the safe, quiet love they'd shared, and comparing it to what she felt for Arthur, wild and dangerous and utterly essential. I think, she said slowly, that I am tired of hiding, tired of being afraid, tired of letting other people decide what my life should look like. What does that mean? It means I do not want to run away. I want to stay here, in this town, in this shop. And I want to be with you, openly, without shame. The words felt like jumping off a cliff, exhilarating and terrifying at once. Let them talk. Let them judge. I am done living my life by their rules. Arthur's face transformed, hope and joy and terror mixing in equal measure. Mylene, are you sure? Because once we do this, once we make it public, I am sure, or at least I am sure that I would rather face their judgment with you than hide alone without you. Then we do this right. Arthur's voice was firm with decision. No more sneaking around, no more pretending we're just acquaintances. I'm going to court you properly, the way you deserve. I'll take you to dinner at the hotel restaurant. I'll walk with you down Main Street. I'll make it clear to everyone that my intentions are honorable and serious. They will say terrible things. Let them. I've got Eleanor Winters and John Parsons on our side now, apparently, and Sarah Mitchell and Mrs. Patterson. That's more than we had before. And the ones who are not on our side? Arthur's jaw set in a hard line. They can either learn to live with it, or they can try to do something about it. And if they try anything like what Webb did, they'll find out just how far I'm willing to go to protect what's mine. The possessiveness in his voice should have bothered her. Instead, it made her feel cherished, claimed in a way that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with belonging. What is mine? She repeated softly. I am not sure I am anyone's but my own. Then let me be yours and you be mine, and we'll both belong to ourselves and each other. Arthur pulled her close, and for the first time they stood together in her shop, her public shop, where anyone could walk in, embracing without fear or shame. The bell chimed, and they sprang apart reflexively, but it was only Mrs. Chen from the laundry, bringing back the curtains she'd taken to clean. She looked at them, at their guilty faces, and smiled. It's about time you two stopped pretending, she said in accented English, even thicker than Mylene's. Everyone already knows. Better to be honest than to sneak like children. After she left, Arthur and Mylene looked at each other and started to laugh. It was giddy, slightly hysterical laughter, the kind that came from relief and terror, and the realization that they'd already crossed a line they couldn't uncross. "So we're doing this," Arthur said when they'd caught their breath. "We're really doing this. We are really doing this. Then I have a question to ask you, and before you answer, I want you to know you can say no. You can ask for more time. You can tell me I'm moving too fast and I'll wait however long it takes." Mylene's heart began to race. "What question?" Arthur took both her hands in his expression more serious than she'd ever seen it. "I know it's only been a few months since we met. I know the whole town is already gossiping about us. I know that what I'm about to ask will make everything harder before it gets better. But Mylene Chen, I'm 43 years old and I've been in love twice in my life. Once with Mary, who I lost, and now with you, who I found when I wasn't even looking. I don't want to waste time. I don't want to wait for the perfect moment that might never come. So I'm asking now, here in your broken shop that we're rebuilding together, surrounded by herbs and hope and the smell of fresh wood. Will you marry me?" The world seemed to stop. Outside, Sweetwater continued its daily rhythms, wagons rolling past, people conducting business, life happening in all its ordinary glory. But inside the apothecary, time had paused on the edge of a question that would change everything. Mylene looked at Arthur's face, at the vulnerability and hope written there. She thought about all the reasons to say no, the town's judgment, the danger, the way this would mark them both as outsiders forever. She thought about the safe choice, the careful choice, the choice that would keep her protected and small. And then she thought about the alternative, about living the rest of her life wondering what if, about growing old alone in this shop, surrounded by remedies for everyone's pain but her own, about letting fear win. "Yes," she heard herself say, the word coming from somewhere deep and certain. "Yes, I will marry you." Arthur's face broke into a smile so wide it must have hurt. He pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet, spinning her around in the small space between broken shelves and scattered herbs. When he set her down, they were both laughing and crying at the same time. "I don't have a ring," he said. "I didn't plan this. I meant to wait, to do it proper with flowers and romance, and I do not need ring right now. I need only this, only you." They kissed then, really kissed for the first time, and it was everything Mylene had been afraid to let herself want. It was tender and passionate, familiar and brand new, the taste of tea and coffee mixing, East meeting West in the most intimate way possible. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Arthur rested his forehead against hers. "So what now?" "Now?" Mylene smiled. "Now we finish fixing shop. Then we tell everyone. And then we watch their faces when they realize we are not going away. They're going to lose their minds." "Good," Mylene said fiercely. "Let them lose their minds. I am done making myself smaller so they can feel comfortable." That night, Arthur stayed late helping her reorganize the medicines that had been salvaged. They worked side by side, Arthur handing her jars while Mylene arranged them on the new shelves, and there was something profound about the domesticity of it. This, Mylene thought, was what marriage to Arthur would be like. Not grand gestures and dramatic proclamations, but quiet partnership in the daily work of living. When the shop was as restored as they could make it in one day, Arthur pulled out his harmonica. "Play for me," Mylene said. "Play something happy." The tune that emerged was still off-key, still punctuated with missed notes and wrong timing. But it was undeniably joyful, a little melody that bounced and skipped like a child. Mylene found herself swaying to it, and before she knew what she was doing, she was dancing, a simple waltz step her mother had taught her decades ago in another lifetime. Arthur stopped playing, watching her with wonder. "You're beautiful when you dance." "I am beautiful when I am happy," Mylene corrected. "And I am happy now. First time in so long, I am happy." "Then I'll spend every day for the rest of our lives making sure you stay that way." It was a promise he couldn't guarantee he'd keep. Life was too uncertain, too full of grief and loss and circumstances beyond control. But standing there in her repaired shop, with the man she loved watching her dance to badly played harmonica music, Mylene chose to believe him anyway. They would announce their engagement tomorrow. They would face whatever came next together. And somehow, against all odds and despite everything the world threw at them, they would survive. They had to. Because the alternative, giving up, giving in, letting fear and prejudice win, was no longer something Mylene could accept. She had been dead for 18 months. Now she was alive again, and she was done apologizing for it. The announcement came not with fanfare, but with a simple walk down Main Street on a Saturday morning when the whole town was out doing their weekly shopping. Arthur arrived at the apothecary just after 9, dressed in his Sunday best despite it being a weekday. He offered Mylene his arm, and she took it without hesitation, her hand resting in the crook of his elbow as naturally as breathing. They walked slowly, deliberately, giving everyone plenty of time to see. Past the general store where Mrs. Abernathy was selecting fabric, past the bank where Charles Winters stood talking with a cattle buyer, past the hotel restaurant where half a dozen ranchers were finishing their breakfast. At each location, conversation stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. Mouths fell open. Arthur kept his gaze forward, his spine straight, but Mylene felt the tension in his arm. This was harder for him than he'd let on, she realized. Not because he doubted his choice, but because he was severing ties with a community that had been his whole world for over a decade. "You're sure?" she whispered as they passed the livery stable. "Never been more sure of anything," he replied, his voice steady. Then louder, so the men loitering outside the stable could hear, "Mylene and I are engaged to be married. We'll be having the ceremony in 3 weeks, and everyone in Sweetwater is invited to witness it." The silence that followed was so complete, Mylene could hear the wind rattling the wooden signs hanging above the shops. Then, like a dam breaking, the whispers started. They rolled through the street in waves, one person turning to another, the news spreading faster than wildfire. Mrs. Abernathy emerged from the general store, her face flushed with outrage. "Arthur Hayes, have you lost your mind? Marrying a Chinese woman? Think of your reputation. Think of your poor Mary." Arthur stopped walking, turned to face her. His voice when he spoke was cold enough to frost glass. "Mrs. Abernathy, I'll thank you not to invoke my late wife's name in service of your prejudices. Mary was the kindest person I ever knew, and she'd be ashamed of how this town has treated Mrs. Chen. As for my reputation, I'd rather have none at all than one built on cowardice and bigotry." "Well, I never—" "No, ma'am, I don't expect you have. Which is why your opinions on my life choices hold about as much weight as your opinions on cattle ranching, which is to say, none at all." He tipped his hat with exaggerated politeness. "Good day." They continued walking, leaving Mrs. Abernathy sputtering in their wake. Mylene's heart was hammering so hard she felt dizzy. But alongside the fear was something else. Pride. Fierce, burning pride in this man who'd just publicly defended her against the most powerful gossip in town. Not everyone reacted with hostility. Sarah Mitchell appeared from the dry goods store, her baby on her hip, and called out, "Congratulations, that's wonderful news." Her voice carried clearly down the street, a deliberate act of public support that cost her social capital she probably couldn't afford to lose. John Parsons, standing outside the bank, nodded at them gravely. "Hayes, Mrs. Chen, best wishes to you both." But the hostile reactions outnumbered the friendly ones. By the time they reached the end of Main Street, Mylene had been called a half-dozen slurs. Some muttered just loud enough to hear, others shouted from the safety of distance. Arthur's jaw grew tighter with each one, his free hand clenching and unclenching at his side. "Let them talk," Mylene said quietly. "Words cannot hurt us if we do not let them." "Those aren't just words. They're people showing you exactly what they think of your humanity, and it makes me want to—" He stopped, visibly fighting for control. "I knew it would be bad. I just didn't realize how much it would hurt to hear them talk about you that way." They had reached the edge of town where the buildings gave way to open prairie. Arthur stopped, turning to face her fully. In the distance, Mylene could see his ranch house, a dark shape against the spring-green hills. "I need you to know something," Arthur said. "Before we go any further down this road, what we're about to face, it's going to get worse before it gets better. There will be people who refuse to do business with either of us. There might be more violence, more vandalism. The town council might try to force you out, claim some violation of ordinance or another. And I can't protect you from all of it, no matter how badly I want to. I know this." "Do you?" "Because I need to make sure you're not agreeing to this out of some sense of obligation, or because you think you don't have other choices. If you want to leave Sweetwater, go somewhere easier. I'll understand. I'll even go with you if you'll have me. But If we stay, if we do this here, he gestured back toward town. We're declaring war, and wars have casualties. Mealing looked at the town behind them, at the place where she'd buried her husband and built her business and carved out an existence from nothing. Then she looked at Arthur, at the man who'd brought her back to life when she'd been certain that part of her was dead forever. In China, there is saying, she said slowly, the nail that sticks up gets hammered down. My whole life, I try to not stick up. I try to be quiet, be invisible, not cause trouble. In my village, in San Francisco, here in Sweetwater, always trying to be small enough that no one notices me. She took his hands in hers. But I am done being small. Let them try to hammer me down. I will be the nail that breaks the hammer. Arthur's laugh was surprised and delighted. That's the spirit. Though I've got to say, you're mixing your metaphors something fierce. Well, English is my third language. I am allowed to mix metaphors. She smiled, then grew serious again. Arthur, I stay not because I have no choice. I stay because this is my home now, and I am tired of letting other people decide where I belong. And I marry you not to escape or because I am afraid to be alone. I marry you because I love you, because you see me, really see me, and that is a gift I thought I would never have again. I do see you, Arthur said softly. I see a woman who's braver than any man I've ever met, who crossed an ocean to start a new life, who buried her husband and kept going, who defended herself against a man twice her size and survived to tell about it. I see someone extraordinary trying to convince herself she's ordinary, and I can't wait to spend the rest of my life proving you wrong about that. They kissed there on the edge of town, in full view of anyone who cared to look. It was a deliberate choice, one final statement that they would not hide, would not apologize, would not pretend to be anything other than what they were. When they finally pulled apart, Mylene noticed a figure on horseback in the distance, watching them. Even from far away, she recognized Sheriff Brody's silhouette. He sat there for a long moment, then turned his horse and rode back toward town. Mylene couldn't tell if his presence was meant as protection or warning, and she supposed it didn't much matter either way. The following days brought a mix of support and hostility that left Mylene emotionally exhausted. The general store refused to sell her supplies, so she had to order from Rock Springs, adding days to her delivery time and extra costs to her expenses. The hotel restaurant made it clear that Arthur was welcome to dine there, but not if he brought that woman with him. Doc Pritchard started spreading rumors that Mylene's medicines were dangerous, possibly poisonous, though he offered no evidence beyond vague insinuations. But there were bright spots too. Eleanor Winters made a point of visiting the apothecary, and her patronage, public and purposeful, carried weight. Other women followed, some out of genuine support, others simply because if the mayor's wife deemed something acceptable, it became socially safe. Mrs. Chen from the laundry organized the other Chinese families in and around Sweetwater, and suddenly Mylene had a community she'd barely known existed. They brought her supplies, offered their labor, and most importantly, made her feel less alone. Arthur faced his own battles. 2 of his ranch hands quit, saying they wouldn't work for a man who'd betrayed his own kind. John Parsons offered to loan Arthur some of his men until he could hire replacements, but good help was hard to find, especially once word got out about the engagement. The Cattlemen's Association held a vote on whether to revoke Arthur's membership, and though the motion failed, the fact that it was proposed at all spoke volumes. Through it all, they clung to each other and to the plans they were making. They would marry on the last Saturday in March, outdoors by the creek where they'd first admitted their feelings. The ceremony would be small, simple, conducted by a traveling minister who'd agreed to perform the service after Eleanor Winters made it worth his while. They would invite everyone, as Arthur had promised, but expect only a handful to actually attend. "What will you wear?" Arthur asked one evening as they sat in her shop, him reading the newspaper while she prepared a batch of cough syrup. "I have dress, blue silk from China. I wear when I marry Wee. Is that wrong, you think? To wear same dress?" Arthur lowered the newspaper, his expression thoughtful. "Wrong? No. But is it what you want, or are you doing it because it's practical?" Mylene paused in her measuring. It was a good question, one that got at the heart of something she'd been avoiding thinking about. The blue silk dress represented her first marriage, her first life. Wearing it to marry Arthur felt both like honoring that past and being unable to escape it. I do not know what I want, she admitted. In China, wedding dress is red. For luck, for joy. But I cannot afford new dress. And even if I could, no dressmaker in Sweetwater would make one for me now. I'll make you one, said a voice from the doorway. They both turned to find Sarah Mitchell standing there, a bolt of crimson fabric in her arms. It's not silk, just cotton, but it's the reddest red I could find. And I was good at sewing before Bethy came along. I might be out of practice, but I can still put together a dress. Mealing stared at her, speechless. Sarah, you cannot. My husband and I had a long talk after what happened with Webb, about what kind of people we want to be, what kind of world we want our daughter to grow up in. Sarah's voice was firm. Tom's not perfect, and he's still got his prejudices, but he agrees that what's happening to you isn't right. And more importantly, he agrees that I don't need his permission to be friends with who I choose. That is very brave. It's not brave, it's just decent, which is a pretty low bar, but apparently we're living in times where decency counts as courage. Sarah held out the fabric. Will you let me do this for you, please? I need to feel like I'm doing something to push back against all the ugliness. Mylene took the fabric, running her fingers over the bright cotton. It wasn't silk, wasn't traditional, wasn't anything she'd imagined for a wedding dress, but it was offered with love, and that made it more precious than the finest material. Yes, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, I would be honored. Sarah returned 3 times over the next week for fittings, each time bringing new pieces of the dress to try on. She worked with a determination that suggested the dress had become more than just clothing. It was a statement, a small rebellion against the forces trying to tear Mylene and Arthur apart. On the final fitting, Sarah stepped back to admire her work. The dress was simple but elegant, with a high collar and long sleeves that Mylene had requested to nod toward Chinese styling. The red was brilliant, unapologetic, impossible to ignore. You look beautiful, Sarah said quietly, like you're ready to take on the world. I feel like I'm ready to take on Sweetwater. Not sure that is same as world. For us? It might as well be. Sarah began pinning up the hem. Mrs. Chen, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Are you scared? About the wedding? About what comes after? Mealing considered the question seriously. Yes, I am terrified. But I also feel more alive than I have in years. Fear and joy together, all mixed up so I cannot tell which is which. I know that feeling. I had it when Bethy was born. So afraid something would go wrong, but also so happy I thought I might burst from it. Sarah tied off a thread, then looked up at Mylene. I think that's what it means to really live. Not to be without fear, but to do the thing anyway. You are wise for someone so young. I'm not wise, I'm just learning that life's too short to spend it afraid of what other people think. The dress completed, attention turned to other preparations. Arthur wanted to buy Mylene a ring, something traditional, but she insisted that was foolish expense when they'd need every penny to rebuild what they'd lost. They compromised on simple gold bands that Arthur ordered from a catalog, plain and unadorned but solid. The minister arrived 3 days before the wedding, a circuit preacher named Reverend Walsh, who traveled between the small towns of Wyoming performing services. He was an older man, late 60s, with white hair and kind eyes, that had seen enough of the world to have worn away most of his judgments. I'll be honest with you both, he said when they met to discuss the ceremony. I've married all kinds of couples in my years, young and old, rich and poor, every combination you can imagine. But I've never married a white man to a Chinese woman. Not because I object, mind you, but because most places wouldn't allow it even if I tried. Wyoming has no law against it, Arthur said. I checked. No legal law, maybe, but plenty of unwritten ones. Walsh looked between them seriously. I need to know that you both understand what you're entering into. This isn't going to be an easy marriage, and not just for the usual reasons marriage is hard. You'll face opposition, discrimination, maybe violence. Your children, if you have them, will belong fully to neither world. Are you prepared for that? Mealing had thought about this question during many sleepless nights. The children issue was complicated in ways that made her heart ache. She was 32 years old, past the age when bearing children was easy or safe. The years with Wee had produced no pregnancies, and she'd long since made peace with the likelihood she'd never be a mother. But Arthur deserved to know this before he committed himself. Arthur, she said quietly, we should talk about children. I am old woman. You're not old. Older than good age for babies, and I may not be able to give you children. You should know this before we marry. Arthur took her hand. I've already had a child, lost him before he could draw 2 days' worth of breath. If we're blessed with children, I'll welcome them. If we're not, I'll still have you, and that's enough. More than enough. You say that now, I say it now, and I'll say it every day for the rest of our lives. I'm not marrying you to get children or to run my house or to fill any particular role. I'm marrying you because you're Mylene Chen, and I'd rather spend my life with you and no children than without you and a dozen. Reverend Walsh nodded approvingly. That's the right answer, son. Marriage is about partnership, not production. He pulled out a small book. Now, let's talk about the ceremony itself. I usually do the traditional vows, but I'm open to modifications if you'd like to include anything from Chinese tradition. They spent the next hour planning, Mylene explaining some of the customs from her village, while Walsh took notes. They settled on a blend, traditional Western vows with a tea ceremony afterward, a sharing of wine from a single cup, and a blessing that Walsh adapted from both Christian and Taoist traditions without committing fully to either. I think, Walsh said as they finished, that this will be one of the most meaningful ceremonies I've ever performed, not in spite of the differences between you, but because of them. You're proving that love can bridge any divide, if we're brave enough to let it. 2 days before the wedding, the town council called an emergency meeting. Arthur attended alone, despite Mylene's offer to come with him. This is about me, he said, about whether they can intimidate me into changing my mind. I need to face them without you there to protect. Show them I'm man enough to stand on my own. He returned 3 hours later, his face tight with controlled anger. Mylene was closing up the shop when he walked in, and one look at his expression told her it had gone badly. Tell me, she said simply. They tried to buy me off. Can you believe that? Mayor Winters stood up, and I don't think it was his idea. I think someone got to him and offered me $10,000 to call off the wedding, said it was for community harmony. When I refused, they threatened to use some old ordinance about public morals to shut down your shop. Said they'd revoke your business license on grounds that you're operating an unlicensed medical practice. Mylene felt ice settle in her stomach. Without the shop, she had nothing. No income, no purpose, no reason to stay in Sweetwater at all. Can they do this? I don't know. I'm going to talk to a lawyer in Rock Springs tomorrow, but Mylene, even if they can't, the fact that they're trying, his voice broke slightly. Maybe we should leave. Just take what we can and start over somewhere else. I can't watch them destroy you piece by piece. No. The word came out harder than she'd intended. No, I am not running. They want me to leave? They will have to drag me out, and even then, I will fight. This isn't just about pride anymore. It is exactly about pride and dignity and the right to exist where I choose to exist. Mylene crossed to him, taking his face in her hands. Arthur, I have been pushed around my whole life. Pushed from my village to San Francisco, pushed from San Francisco here, pushed into corners and shadows and small, safe spaces. I am done being pushed. If they shut down my shop, I will operate from your ranch. If they run us out of Sweetwater, we go on our terms, not theirs. But I will not give them the satisfaction of watching me leave before the wedding. I will marry you in 3 days, in front of anyone who has courage to watch, and I will do it with my head high. Arthur pulled her close, and she felt him trembling slightly. You scare me sometimes, you know that? The strength in you, it's humbling. I'm not strong, I'm just stubborn. There is difference. If you say so. He kissed the top of her head. All right, we do this. We get married, and then we deal with whatever they throw at us next. Together. Together, Mylene agreed. The night before the wedding, Mylene couldn't sleep. She sat in her apartment, surrounded by the few possessions she'd carried from China, and thought about the journey that had brought her here. From a small village in Guangdong to the chaos of San Francisco's docks, from her marriage to Wei to his death in the mines, from 18 months of numbness to the terrifying aliveness she felt now. A knock at the back door startled her. It was nearly midnight, far too late for visitors. She moved cautiously down the stairs, grabbing a heavy pestle as she went. After Webb's attack, she'd become paranoid about late-night sounds. Who is there? It's Eleanor Winters. I'm sorry for the late hour, but I needed to speak with you privately. Mylene opened the door to find the mayor's wife standing in the alley, wrapped in a heavy cloak despite the warming weather. Eleanor looked tired, older than she had during her previous visit. Mrs. Winters, is something wrong? May I come in? What I have to say isn't for the street. Once inside, with the door locked behind them, Eleanor pulled a small bag from beneath her cloak. This is for you, for the wedding. Mylene opened the bag to find jewelry, a necklace of jade beads, earrings to match, and a hairpin carved with intricate flowers. They were Chinese pieces, old and valuable, the kind of jewelry her mother might have worn on special occasions. I cannot accept this. They belong to my first husband's mother. She gave them to me before she died, said they'd been in her family for generations. I was supposed to pass them to my daughter, but I never had children. Eleanor's voice was soft with old grief. I want you to have them, Mylene. I want them to go to someone who'll appreciate what they represent. Tradition, heritage, the courage it takes to hold on to yourself when the world wants you to disappear. But your husband, the council, Charles doesn't speak for me. Not about this. Eleanor's face hardened. I know about the meeting, about what they tried to do. My husband caved to pressure from men who think money and fear can control everything. I'm ashamed of him, but I'm not ashamed of you or Arthur or what you're doing tomorrow. You could lose everything if you support us. I could. Or I could finally do the right thing, 20 years too late. Eleanor took Mylene's hands. When my first husband died, I let them erase him. Let them pretend he'd never existed, that I'd never loved him. I married Charles and became respectable again. And with every year that passed, I felt a little more like I'd betrayed the man who'd loved me when no one else would. Don't let them do that to you, Mylene. Don't let them make you small. After Eleanor left, Mylene sat for a long time holding the jade beads, feeling the weight of history and hope in her hands. Tomorrow she would put them on. Tomorrow she would wear red and jade and marry a man this town said she had no right to love. Tomorrow she would either begin a new life or watch everything burn. Either way, she would face it standing tall. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, one of those perfect spring days that felt like a gift. Mylene woke before sunrise, too nervous to sleep, and spent the early hours preparing herself. She washed her hair with the special herbs she'd saved for important occasions, dressed carefully in the red dress Sarah had made, fastened Eleanor's jade around her neck. When she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. Not because she looked different, but because the woman looking back at her stood differently. Shoulders back, chin up, eyes clear, and unafraid. This was a woman ready to claim her own life. Arthur arrived at mid-morning to escort her to the creek. He wore a new suit, black wool that must have cost him more than he could afford, and his hair was freshly cut. When he saw her in the red dress, he stopped breathing for a moment. "You're beautiful," he said finally. "You take my breath away. You look very handsome yourself, like proper American gentlemen. I look like a rancher in clothes too fancy for him. But for you, I'd wear a damn ball gown if that's what it took." They walked to the creek together, taking the long way around the edge of town rather than through it. Mylene had expected to make the walk alone, to meet Arthur at the ceremony site. But he'd insisted on coming for her, on making it clear from the very beginning that they were equals in this, partners. When they arrived at the creek, Mylene was shocked to find nearly 40 people gathered on the banks. She'd expected a handful at most, Sarah and her husband Tom, Eleanor Winters maybe, Mrs. Chen from the laundry, and a few others. But there were far more than that. John Parsons stood near the front with his wife and 3 children. The carpenter Kowalski had come with his entire family, even Mrs. Kowalski, who'd sworn she'd never acknowledged the marriage. Sheriff Brody was there, not in any official capacity, but as a witness. And to Mylene's complete astonishment, so was Doc Pritchard, looking uncomfortable but present nonetheless. "I thought," she started, but Arthur squeezed her hand. "Turns out you've got more friends than you realized. News of the council trying to shut down your shop spread fast. Some folks didn't like that. Didn't like bullying, even if they weren't entirely comfortable with the wedding itself. So they came to make a statement. Reverend Walsh stood waiting by the water, his white hair bright in the sun. Behind him, Mrs. Chen and her daughters had decorated the area with early spring flowers, forsythia and daffodils, crocuses and wild violets. It was simple but beautiful, a testament to what could be created when people chose kindness over fear. As Mylene and Arthur walked toward the Reverend, the crowd parted to let them through. She heard whispers, saw some disapproving faces, but she also saw Sarah Mitchell beaming at her with tears in her eyes, saw Eleanor Winters standing tall and proud, daring anyone to comment, saw Sheriff Brody give her a small, approving nod. Reverend Walsh smiled as they took their places before him. "Dearly beloved and honored guests," he began, his voice carrying across the water. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of two souls who have found each other across distances both geographic and cultural. This is not a traditional wedding by any measure, but love, real love, is never traditional. It's extraordinary." The ceremony was brief and beautiful, blending customs in ways that would have scandalized purists on both sides, but felt exactly right to Mylene. She and Arthur exchanged traditional vows, promising to love and honor each other. Then they shared tea in the Chinese style, offering cups to each other as symbols of respect and partnership. Finally, they drank wine from a single glass, their hands intertwined around the stem, while Walsh offered blessings drawn from a dozen different traditions. When Walsh finally said, "You may kiss your bride," Arthur did so with a tenderness that made Mylene's eyes burn with tears. It was a gentle kiss, reverent, full of promise and hope, and the courage it had taken to get to this moment. "I present to you," Walsh announced to the gathered crowd, "Mr. and Mrs. Arthur Hayes." The applause that followed was not universal. Some people stood silent, their faces disapproving. But enough hands came together to make a real sound, a genuine celebration. And when Sarah Mitchell let out a whoop of joy, others joined in, until the creek bank echoed with cheering. They were married, against all odds, despite all opposition, in front of witnesses who would carry the news back to town. There was no taking it back now, no pretending this hadn't happened. Mylene Chen was Mylene Hayes, and the world would simply have to accept it. The celebration that followed the ceremony was modest but genuine. Mrs. Chen and her daughters had prepared food, a mixture of Chinese dumplings and American apple pie, symbolic of the bridge being built between two worlds. People ate standing by the creek, clusters forming and reforming as those who'd come out of solidarity tried to reconcile their presence with their lingering discomfort. Mylene watched it all with a strange sense of detachment, as if she were observing someone else's wedding rather than living her own. The red dress felt both like armor and like skin, protecting her while leaving her vulnerable. Arthur stayed close, his hand never far from hers, a steady presence anchoring her to the reality of what they'd just done. "You all right?" he asked quietly as they stood a little apart from the others. "I keep waiting for something terrible to happen, for someone to stand up and object, or for the sky to fall, or—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "I cannot believe it is real, that we are actually married. We're married, Mrs. Hayes. You're stuck with me now." The name startled her. Mrs. Hayes. She'd been Mrs. Chen for so long that this new identity felt like a costume she hadn't yet learned to wear. But hearing it from Arthur's lips made it real in a way the ceremony hadn't quite managed. "Mrs. Hayes?" she repeated, testing the sound. "It is strange, but good strange." They were interrupted by Sheriff Brody, who approached with his hat in his hands and an expression Mylene couldn't quite read. "Mr. and Mrs. Hayes," he said formally. "Congratulations on your marriage." "Thank you, Sheriff," Arthur replied, his tone cautious. "Didn't expect to see you here." "Didn't expect to be here myself," Brody admitted, "but something you said at the council meeting stuck with me, about standing up for what's right even when it's inconvenient. Made me think about what kind of lawman I want to be." He turned to Mylene. "Mrs. Hayes, I owe you an apology. I should have done more when Webb attacked you. Should have stood up to the council when they tried to intimidate you. I let expedience override justice. And that was wrong." Mylene studied him, searching for insincerity and finding none. "Thank you, Sheriff. That means more than you know." "There's more. The council's planning to move forward with revoking your business license. They're meeting Monday to make it official." Before Mylene could react to this blow, Brody continued. "But I spoke with the territorial attorney in Rock Springs. Turns out they don't have the legal grounds they think they do. The ordinance they're citing was written for houses of ill repute, not legitimate businesses. If you fight it, you'll win. How do I fight? Mylene asked, her heart beginning to race. You show up to the meeting. You bring witnesses who will testify to the legitimacy of your practice. You make them state their real objections on the record, in front of everyone. Brody's eyes were steady. I'll be there too, to make sure things stay civil, and I'll testify on your behalf, if it comes to that. After he left, Arthur pulled Mylene into his arms. Did that just happen? Did Sheriff Brody just become our ally? I think he is trying to become the man he wishes he was, Mylene said softly. That is good enough for me. The gathering began to disperse as the afternoon wore on. Sarah Mitchell hugged Mylene tightly before leaving. You did it, she whispered. You actually did it. You give the rest of us hope that maybe we can be brave too. Eleanor Winters was among the last to depart. She pressed a folded paper into Mylene's hands. This is the name and address of a lawyer in Cheyenne. He's handled cases involving Chinese immigrants before, knows the relevant laws. If the council gives you trouble, wire him. Tell him I sent you. Why you help me so much? Mylene asked. You risk everything. Because I didn't help the right person 20 years ago, and I've regretted it every day since. You don't get many chances in life to correct your mistakes. I'm taking mine. Eleanor smiled, and for a moment she looked years younger. Besides, watching you two thumb your noses at convention reminds me what it felt like to be young and fearless. I'd forgotten. When everyone had gone and they were finally alone by the creek, Arthur took both of Mylene's hands in his. So, we're married. What happens now? Now we go home, Mylene said, then paused. But which home? The shop or the ranch? The ranch is bigger, has room for both of us, for your work if you need to set up there. But the decision is yours, Mylene. I'm not going to tell you where you have to live. Mylene thought about the apartment above the shop, where she'd spent 18 months in grief, where Webb had attacked her, where every room held memories of Wee. Then she thought about Arthur's ranch house, which she'd only seen from the outside, but which represented possibility rather than past. The ranch, she decided. At least for tonight. Tomorrow we face the council and decide what comes next. But tonight, I want to be somewhere new, somewhere that is ours, not mine or yours, but ours together. They rode to the Double H Ranch as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Arthur's horse carried them both, Mylene sitting in front of him, his arms around her, keeping her safe and steady. It should have felt awkward, this closeness, but instead it felt like the most natural thing in the world. The ranch house was larger than Mylene had expected, a 2-story structure that spoke of prosperity and careful planning. Arthur helped her down from the horse, then hesitated at the door. I should warn you, he said, looking embarrassed. I haven't had a woman's touch in the house for 2 years. It's clean, but sparse. Nothing fancy. I do not need fancy. I need home. The interior was indeed sparse, but it was clean and well maintained. The main room held a large fireplace, a worn sofa, and a dining table that looked handmade. The kitchen was functional, with a good stove and ample counter space. Upstairs, Arthur showed her 3 bedrooms, one of which he'd clearly been using. This was the room Mary and I shared, he said quietly, standing in the doorway. I moved to the smaller room after she died. Couldn't bear to sleep here without her. But if you want this room, if you want us to have this room, I think I'm ready for that now. Mylene walked into the room, taking in the solid furniture, the large bed, the window that looked out over the prairie. It was a good room, filled with afternoon light, and it didn't feel haunted the way she'd feared it might. Mary's presence was here, yes, but not as a ghost demanding loyalty. More like a blessing, a gentle passing of responsibility from one woman to another. We take this room, Mylene decided. Mary would want you to live here again, I think. Not to forget her, but to keep living. I think you're right. Arthur crossed to her, cupping her face gently. I loved her, Mylene. I need you to know that. I loved her with everything I had. I know. I loved Wee too. We do not stop loving them because we love each other now. We just make room for both. That night they came together as husband and wife for the first time, and it was nothing like Mylene had expected. With Wee, intimacy had been quiet and dutiful, pleasant but not passionate, But with Arthur, it was different. There was tenderness, yes, but also hunger, a desperate need to affirm their choice through touch and closeness. Afterward, lying in the darkness with Arthur's arms around her, Mylene felt something she hadn't felt since before Wee's death. Complete. Not because Arthur completed her, she was whole on her own, but because choosing to share her wholeness with someone who saw and valued it felt like the greatest gift she could give or receive. "What are you thinking?" Arthur asked, his voice drowsy. "I am thinking that I am happy, truly, deeply happy, and also terrified because happiness this big feels dangerous, like it can be taken away too easily." "It can be," Arthur said honestly. "Life doesn't come with guarantees, but hiding from happiness to avoid losing it, that's just another way of letting fear win. And you're not someone who lets fear win. I am someone who is very afraid very often. Being afraid and letting fear control you are different things. You can be scared and brave at the same time. I think that might be the only kind of brave that really counts." Monday came too quickly. Mylene woke in Arthur's arms, disoriented for a moment by the unfamiliar room before memory rushed back. Married. She was married now, to this man whose breath tickled the back of her neck, whose steady heartbeat had been the last thing she'd heard before falling asleep. "Morning, wife," Arthur murmured against her shoulder. "Morning, husband." The words still felt strange in her mouth, but less strange than they had 2 days ago. They dressed carefully for the town council meeting, both aware that appearance would matter. Arthur in his new suit, Mylene in a simple but elegant tunic and pants with Eleanor's jade at her throat. Armor for the battle ahead. The council met in a room above the bank, and by the time Arthur and Mylene arrived, it was already crowded with townspeople who'd come to watch the spectacle. Mrs. Abernathy sat in the front row, her face smug with anticipated victory. But Mylene also spotted Sarah Mitchell, Mrs. Chen, and her daughters, John Parsons, and surprisingly, Doc Pritchard, though the doctor wouldn't meet her eyes. Mayor Charles Winters called the meeting to order, looking deeply uncomfortable. "We're here to address the matter of the business license for the apothecary on Main Street, currently operated by Mrs. Mylene Chen." He paused, correcting himself. "Mrs. Mylene Hayes." Councilmember Theodore Blackwell, who owned the hotel, leaned forward eagerly. "The council has determined that Mrs. Hayes is operating an unlicensed medical practice in violation of Territorial Ordinance 47, which prohibits the operation of certain establishments without proper documentation." Sheriff Brody stood from his seat in the back. "Point of order, Mr. Mayor. I've reviewed Ordinance 47. It pertains specifically to brothels and gambling houses, not medical practices. There's no territorial law requiring licensure for herbalists or apothecaries." Blackwell's face reddened. "The spirit of the law." "The spirit of the law is irrelevant when the letter of the law doesn't support your position," interrupted a new voice. A man Mylene had never seen before stood near the door, holding a leather satchel. He was young, maybe 30, with sharp eyes and the bearing of someone used to being listened to. "My name is Daniel Reeves. I'm an attorney from Cheyenne, here representing Mrs. Hayes." Mylene glanced at Arthur, who looked as surprised as she felt. "I didn't hire a lawyer," she whispered. "Mrs. Winters," Arthur whispered back. "She must have wired him." Reeves approached the council table, pulling documents from his satchel. "I have here copies of territorial law regarding business licensing. You'll find no provision requiring special documentation for the sale of herbal remedies. In fact, Mrs. Hayes's business falls under the same category as any general store selling patent medicines, none of which require licensing beyond standard business permits." "She's not selling patent medicines," Blackwell sputtered. "She's mixing strange Oriental concoctions. Are you suggesting that being of Chinese origin makes her business inherently illegal? Because I should warn you that arguing ethnic discrimination in the public record could have significant legal consequences for this council." Reeves's tone was mild, but his meaning was clear. Mayor Winters shuffled papers nervously. "Perhaps we should table this matter until we can consult with the territorial attorney." "No need," Reeves continued smoothly. "I've already spoken with him. He agrees with my assessment. Mrs. Hayes's business is entirely legal under current territorial law. Any attempt to revoke her license based on this ordinance would not only fail, but would expose the council to potential civil action." The room erupted in whispers. Mylene sat very still, hardly daring to believe what was happening. Was it possible? Could it really be this simple? However, Reeves said, and Myleen's heart sank. Mrs. Hayes would like to address the council directly, not about the law, but about the broader issue at hand. All eyes turned to Myleen. She hadn't known she'd be speaking, hadn't prepared anything. But as she stood, words began to form in her mind, born from months of fear and frustration, and finally, after the wedding, hope. "Honored council members," she began, her accent thick but her voice steady. "I come to Sweetwater 4 years ago with my husband Wee. We have nothing but knowledge of herbs and hope for new life. This town, it is not always kind to us. People stare, say cruel things, make us feel like we do not belong. But we work hard, we help people. When children are sick, when women have pain, when men hurt from their work, we give medicine that helps. Not always, but often enough that people keep coming back." She paused, gathering her courage. "When we die, I think maybe I should leave. Go to San Francisco, where there are more Chinese people, where I am not so alone. But I stay. You know why? Because this is my home now. I bury my husband here. I build business here. My life is here, even if many people wish it was not." Several council members had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Now I marry Arthur Hayes, and some of you very angry about this. You want to punish me for loving wrong man. You want to take my business, make me leave. But I ask you, what is my crime? I hurt no one. I follow all laws. I pay my taxes. I help sick people. My only crime is being Chinese and falling in love with white man. Is this really worth destroying someone's life over?" Mrs. Abernathy stood abruptly. "It's not about you personally. It's about maintaining standards, about what kind of precedent this sets. It sets precedent of love being stronger than hate," Myleen interrupted, her voice rising. "It sets precedent of choosing people over prejudice. What you're really afraid of is that if you accept me and Arthur, you have to question all your other prejudices. You have to think maybe you are wrong about Chinese people, about who belongs in your town, about who deserves happiness." She turned to address the crowd rather than just the council. "I know many of you here. Mrs. Patterson, I give your son medicine when he have the croup. Save his life, doctor says. Mr. Kowalski, I fix your wife's headaches when nothing else works. Mrs. Mitchell, I help your baby when she have terrible rash. All of you, at some time, you need my help. And I give it, no questions, no judgment, just medicine and care. Now I ask, is that worth something? Or does my skin color erase all the good I do?" The silence that followed was profound. Then Sarah Mitchell stood, holding her baby. "It's worth something. It's worth everything. Mrs. Hayes saved my daughter from misery. I won't sit here and watch you punish her for finding happiness." One by one, others stood. Mrs. Patterson, her voice shaking. "She did save Timothy. I never thanked her proper for that. I should have." Mrs. Chen from the laundry, her English halting but fierce. "Chinese people, we are not animals. We are humans, just like you. Mrs. Hayes is good woman, good doctor. You shame yourselves with this." Even Doc Pritchard rose, though he looked like standing cost him dearly. "I've not always been fair to Mrs. Hayes. Professional jealousy, I suppose. But she knows medicines I don't, helps people I can't. This town needs her, and frankly, who she marries is none of our damned business." The tide had turned, and Myleen could see it in the council members' faces. Theodore Blackwell still looked furious, but he was alone in his anger. The others were reassessing, calculating, realizing that public opinion was shifting in ways they hadn't anticipated. Mayor Winters cleared his throat. "In light of the legal opinion provided by Mr. Reeves, and considering the testimony we've heard today, I move to dismiss the proceedings against Mrs. Hayes' business license. All in favor?" The vote was 4-1, with only Blackwell dissenting. Just like that, it was over. Myleen's shop was safe, her business secure under the law. But more than that, something fundamental had shifted in Sweetwater. Not everyone would accept her and Arthur. Not everyone would approve. But enough people had stood up, had spoken out, that the landscape of possibility had changed. The town would have to make room for them, whether it wanted to or not. As they left the meeting, people approached to offer congratulations or apologies, or simply acknowledgement. It was overwhelming, this sudden acceptance after so much hostility. Mylene felt Arthur's hand at her back, steady and sure, reminding her she didn't have to navigate this alone. Outside, Eleanor Winters waited by their wagon. "Mr. Reeves performed admirably, didn't he?" "You sent him," Mylene said. "Why?" "Because someone needed to, and I had the means to do it. Consider it a wedding present." Eleanor smiled. "Also, I quite enjoyed watching Theodore Blackwell's face turn that particular shade of purple. The man's been insufferable for years. How can we ever repay you? Live well. Love openly. Show this town that different doesn't mean wrong. That's payment enough." The weeks that followed brought their own challenges. Some businesses still refused to serve Mylene. Some families forbade their children from going near the apothecary. There were occasional slurs shouted from safe distances. Hateful letters slipped under the door. But there were also customers who returned, sheepish and apologetic, admitting they'd let fear override sense. There were invitations to dinner from people like the Mitchells and the Parsons, tentative friendships being formed. Mylene divided her time between the shop and the ranch, finding a rhythm that worked. She kept the apothecary open 4 days a week, spending the other 3 helping Arthur with the ranch. It turned out she had a knack for animal care. Her knowledge of herbs translated well to treating livestock, and she began developing remedies specifically for the cattle and horses. Arthur hired new ranch hands to replace the ones who'd quit, and to everyone's surprise, 2 of them were Chinese men from the railroad camp. They spoke Cantonese, which was different from Mylene's Mandarin, but close enough that they could communicate. Having them around made the ranch feel more complete, a true blending of worlds rather than Mylene trying to fit into Arthur's existing one. One evening in late spring, nearly 2 months after the wedding, Mylene was preparing dinner when Arthur came in from the fields with an odd expression on his face. "What is wrong?" she asked immediately. "Nothing's wrong. Something's right, actually. Very right." He pulled an envelope from his pocket. "Got a letter today from a rancher up in Montana. Heard about our situation through some association newsletter. He's having trouble with a similar issue, wants to marry a Shoshone woman, and his community is giving him hell for it. What he wants from us? Advice, support, proof that it's possible." Arthur set the letter on the table. "Made me realize something. We're not just living our lives anymore, Mylene. We're showing other people that it can be done, that love can cross these lines people think are uncrossable." Mylene picked up the letter, reading the hope and desperation in every line. What we tell him? We tell him the truth, that it's hard and it hurts and people will judge you for it, but also that it's worth it, that living authentically, loving who you love, that's worth more than the approval of people who can't see past their own prejudices. They wrote back to the Montana rancher together that night, Arthur writing while Mylene dictated, their voices blending into something neither could have created alone. It was the first of many such letters they'd write over the years, reaching out to couples facing similar struggles, building a quiet network of people who'd chosen love over fear. Summer arrived with its usual Wyoming intensity, hot days and cool nights, thunderstorms that rolled across the prairie with biblical fury. The apothecary thrived, Mylene's reputation growing beyond Sweetwater to neighboring towns. People traveled hours to see her, drawn by word of her skill with difficult cases. Arthur's ranch prospered too, his cattle healthy, and his reputation as a fair employer spreading among the Chinese laborers looking for work after the railroad jobs dried up. On an August evening, 6 months after their wedding, Mylene was closing up the shop when Sheriff Brody appeared at her door. Her first instinct was still fear. Old habits died hard, but his expression was neutral rather than threatening. "Mrs. Hayes, got a minute?" "Of course, Sheriff." He stepped inside, removing his hat. "I wanted you to know that Marcus Webb was arrested in Rock Springs last week. Tried to rob a Chinese merchant at knife point. Didn't realize the merchant's son was a former railroad enforcer who knew how to handle himself. Webb's looking at 5 years in territorial prison." Mylene absorbed this news, waiting for satisfaction or vindication or relief. Instead, she felt only a distant sadness for the waste of it all. "Thank you for telling me." "There's more." Before he was arrested, Webb had been drinking in a saloon, bragging about how he'd taught that China woman a lesson back in Sweetwater. Several people heard him admit to deliberately targeting you, destroying your shop. If you wanted to press charges now, we'd have witnesses and his own confession. Will it change anything? Will it give me back what he took? No, ma'am, but it might give you justice. Mylene thought about justice, about revenge, about the cost of holding on to anger. I do not want to press charges, Sheriff. Webb is already in prison for his other crime. That is enough. I want to spend my energy on building my life, not destroying his. Brody studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You're a better person than most, Mrs. Hayes. Better than me, certainly. Not better. Just tired of fighting, tired of letting hate use up space in my heart that could hold something else instead. That night she told Arthur about the conversation. They were sitting on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sun set over the hills, the sky turning shades of pink and gold that seemed impossible. Are you sure? Arthur asked. About not pressing charges? After what he did to you? I am sure. Not because I forgive him, but because I refuse to let what he did define the rest of my life. He took one night from me, Arthur. He does not get to take any more. Arthur pulled her close, and they sat in silence as the stars began to appear. These moments had become Mylene's favorite part of each day. The quiet intimacy of simply existing together, no words necessary, just presence and peace. The first frost came in October, earlier than expected, catching everyone off guard. Mylene was at the shop when a young woman burst through the door, panic written across her face. Please, you have to help. My sister, she's having a baby, and something's wrong. Doc Pritchard's out of town, and the midwife won't come because we can't pay, and... The words tumbled over each other in desperation. Take me to her, Mylene said immediately, grabbing her medical bag. How far? 3 miles south, the old Henderson place. They rode hard, the young woman's horse barely keeping pace with Mylene's. When they arrived at the dilapidated farmhouse, Mylene could hear screaming from inside. She'd assisted Wee with difficult births before, though it was always dangerous, always terrifying. The laboring woman was young, maybe 20, and she'd been in labor for over a day. One look told Mylene this was serious. The baby was breech, turned wrong, and the mother was exhausted beyond the point of being able to push effectively. I need hot water, clean cloths, and whiskey, Mylene commanded, falling into the calm authority she always found in medical emergencies. And someone needs to ride for Doc Pritchard. He won't come, the sister said bitterly. We're squatters here. No money, no standing in town. He won't waste his time. Then we do this ourselves, Mylene said firmly. What is your sister's name? Anne. I'm Margaret. Anne, I am Mylene. I'm going to help you, but you must trust me and do exactly what I say. Understand? The next hour was the longest of Mylene's life. She'd learned techniques from Wee, from the midwives in her village, from trial and error over the years. She used all of it now, manually turning the baby while Anne screamed, guiding, encouraging, sometimes demanding. Margaret helped as best she could, holding her sister's hand, offering water, following Mylene's rapid instructions. When the baby finally emerged, blue and silent, Mylene's heart stopped. She'd lost mothers before, lost babies, knew the terrible weight of that failure. But she refused to accept it now. She cleared the infant's mouth, rubbed its tiny chest, breathed gentle puffs of air into its lungs. Come on, she whispered in Chinese. Come on, little one. You can do this. You are strong. You are a survivor. Come on. The baby gasped, then cried, a thin wailing sound that was the most beautiful thing Mylene had ever heard. She wrapped the infant in clean cloth and placed her in Anne's arms, tears streaming down her own face. A girl, she said unnecessarily. You have a daughter. Anne looked up at Mylene with exhausted wonder. You saved her. You saved us both. You saved yourself. I just helped. Margaret insisted on paying something, offering a chicken and a dozen eggs, which was clearly all they had. Mylene accepted the eggs but refused the chicken. Save it for when your sister needs good food for strength. She will need to eat well to make milk for the baby. She left them there as the sun was setting, bone-tired but filled with a profound sense of rightness. This was why she did this work. Not for money or recognition, but for moments like this, life continuing despite all the forces arrayed against it. When she got back to the ranch well after dark, Arthur was waiting on the porch, nearly frantic with worry. Where were you? I was about to organize a search party. Delivering a baby. Breech birth, very difficult. but both are alive and healthy. She dismounted stiffly, every muscle aching. Arthur, I need to train someone. Need to teach what I know about difficult births, about emergency medicine. If I had not been available today, that woman and her baby would have died. There should be more than one person in this territory who can handle such things. So train someone. Hell, train 10 people. Whatever you think is needed. The idea took root and grew. Over the winter, Mylene began teaching, first informally to women who came to the shop, then more formally as word spread. She taught herbal medicine, emergency care, childbirth assistance. Some of her students were white women hungry for knowledge their doctors wouldn't share. Others were Chinese women from the railroad camps who knew traditional medicine but needed to learn how to explain it to white patients. Sarah Mitchell became one of her most dedicated students, and Eleanor Winters surprised everyone by joining as well. I'm too old to learn a new profession, Eleanor said, but I'm not too old to learn how to help in an emergency. And besides, it irritates Theodore Blackwell to no end that the mayor's wife is studying Chinese medicine. By spring, Sweetwater had a network of women trained in basic medical care, able to handle emergencies when the doctor was unavailable or unwilling. Doc Pritchard initially resented this, seeing it as competition, but eventually came to appreciate having backup when cases overwhelmed his capacity. The anniversary of their wedding approached, and Arthur insisted on celebrating properly. He'd ordered something special, he said, a surprise that had taken months to arrange. When the package finally arrived, Mylene unwrapped it to find a sign, professionally painted in both English and Chinese characters. Chen Hei's Apothecary and Medical Supplies, it read, healing through partnership. I thought, Arthur said nervously as Mylene stared at the sign, that the shop should reflect both our names, both our heritages. If that's all right with you. If it's not, I can... She stopped his words with a kiss. It is perfect. More than perfect. They hung the sign together the next day, Arthur on the ladder while Mylene directed from below. A crowd gathered to watch, and when the sign was finally secured, someone started clapping. The applause spread, not universal but real, an acknowledgement of how far they'd come. That night, lying in bed with Arthur's arms around her, Mylene thought about the journey that had brought her here. From a grieving widow convinced her life was over to a woman who'd found not just love, but purpose, not just acceptance, but agency. She thought about about Mary, about the ghost that had shaped them and the love that had freed them. What are you thinking about? Arthur asked, his voice sleepy. I am thinking that I am grateful for all of it, even the hard parts, the painful parts, because without those, I would not have become who I am now. I would not have found you. I'm grateful, too, for every moment that led me to you, even the ones that nearly broke me. They drifted towards sleep, and in that space between waking and dreams, Mylene heard herself say something she hadn't planned. Arthur, I think I might be pregnant. His arms tightened around her immediately. You think? Or you know? I am 70% sure, maybe 80. I wanted to wait longer before saying anything, in case I am wrong, in case it ends badly. His voice was gentle, understanding. Mylene, whatever happens, we face it together. If you're pregnant, that's a miracle. If you're not, you're still everything I need. And if you are pregnant and something goes wrong... He paused, and she felt him struggling with old grief. Then we'll survive that too. Together. As it turned out, she was pregnant. By summer, there was no doubt, her body changing in ways both wonderful and terrifying. She was 33 years old, not ancient, but not young either, and the pregnancy was hard. Morning sickness that lasted all day, exhaustion that made working difficult, fears that kept her awake at night worrying about all the things that could go wrong. But there were bright moments too. Feeling the baby move for the first time, a flutter like butterflies that made her laugh with joy. Arthur talking to her swelling belly, telling their child stories about the ranch, about China, about two people who'd loved each other enough to change the world around them. The way the women of Sweetwater rallied around her, bringing food and advice and support, even from those who'd been hostile before. Babies have a way of softening people, Eleanor Winters observed one afternoon, bringing yet another casserole. Even the most prejudiced find it hard to hate a child. The labor came in January, a year and 10 months after the wedding, during one of the worst blizzards Sweetwater had seen in a decade. Doc Pritchard couldn't make it through the snow, and even Sarah Mitchell, who'd promised to attend the birth, was trapped in her own home. So it was just Mylene and Arthur and the two Chinese ranch hands who'd helped with difficult animal births but never a human one. Mylene directed them as best she could between contractions, her medical knowledge warring with her pain and fear. "I cannot do this," she gasped at one point, exhausted beyond bearing. "Arthur, I cannot—" "You can," he said firmly, his hand gripping hers. "You're the strongest person I've ever met. You can do anything." The labor lasted 18 hours, and there were moments when Mylene was certain she would die, certain the baby would die, certain this was punishment for daring to be happy. But when the baby finally emerged, squalling and furious and perfectly healthy, all the fear dissolved into wonder. "A boy," Arthur said, his voice choked with tears. "We have a son." They named him James Wee Hayes, honoring both the past and the future. He had Mylene's dark hair and eyes, but Arthur's strong features, a perfect blend of both heritages. Holding him, Mylene felt something settle in her soul, a completion she hadn't known she was seeking. The town's reaction to James was complicated. Some people softened immediately, unable to maintain their prejudice in the face of an innocent child. Others doubled down, calling him ugly names that made Mylene's blood boil. But most fell somewhere in the middle, uncertain how to categorize a child who belonged to both worlds and fully to neither. "He'll face challenges we can't protect him from," Arthur said one night as they watched James sleep. "People will judge him for being mixed, will try to make him feel like he doesn't belong anywhere." "Then we teach him that he belongs everywhere," Mylene replied firmly. "We teach him both languages, both cultures. We teach him to be proud of all his heritage, not ashamed of any of it. And we teach him that the people who judge him for his blood are the ones with the problem, not him." As James grew, they did exactly that. He learned Chinese from Mylene and English from Arthur, switching between languages as easily as breathing. They celebrated both American holidays and Chinese festivals, teaching him the stories and traditions of both cultures. They never tried to make him choose between his heritages, insisting instead that he could hold both with equal pride. By the time James was 3, the landscape of Sweetwater had shifted in ways no one could have predicted. 2 more mixed marriages had taken place. The Montana rancher had indeed married his Shoshone woman and moved to Wyoming, and a white schoolteacher had married a Chinese merchant from Rock Springs. The town was slowly, grudgingly, learning to accept diversity not as a threat, but simply as reality. The apothecary thrived, now employing 2 assistants and serving patients from across the territory. Mylene had published a small book of herbal remedies, blending Chinese and Western medical knowledge, that was being used by frontier doctors throughout Wyoming and Montana. Her training program had expanded, with women coming from as far as Denver to study with her. Arthur's ranch had become known as a place where hardworking men of any background could find fair employment and respectful treatment. The crew was a mix of white, Chinese, and Mexican workers who'd learned to function as a team, united by shared purpose rather than divided by difference. On their 5th anniversary, Mylene and Arthur stood by the creek where they'd been married, watching James play in the shallows while they talked about the future. "Do you ever regret it?" Arthur asked. "Staying here, fighting instead of running?" Mylene considered the question seriously. There had been hard days, terrible days when the prejudice and hatred felt overwhelming, days when she'd wondered if they'd made a terrible mistake. But looking at James splashing happily in the water, thinking about the lives she'd saved and the students she'd taught, and the small but real changes they'd helped create in Sweetwater, no, she didn't regret it. "I regret the pain," she said finally. "I regret that it had to be so hard that people could not just accept us from the beginning. But I do not regret choosing love. I do not regret choosing you. Even knowing everything you'd have to face? Especially knowing that. Because facing it, surviving it, building a life despite it, that made us who we are. And I like who we are." Arthur pulled her close, and they stood together watching their son play, listening to the creek murmur its eternal song. The same creek where they'd first admitted their feelings, where they'd been married, where they'd brought James for his first swimming lesson. It had witnessed their entire journey, from broken individuals to a united family. "Mama! Papa! Come see!" James called out in a mix of Chinese and English, holding up a smooth stone he'd found. "It's beautiful." They went to him, admiring his treasure, and in that simple moment of family joy, Mylene felt the truth of what they'd built. Not a perfect life. There was no such thing, but a real one, authentic and hard-won, purchased with courage and maintained through love. The town of Sweetwater continued around them, its rhythms unchanged. Some people still whispered when Mylene passed, still made their children cross the street to avoid her family. But others waved in greeting, stopped to admire James, asked about her latest remedies. The town was learning, slowly, that different didn't mean dangerous, that love could cross boundaries they'd thought were absolute, that families came in more forms than they'd imagined. And if Sweetwater never fully accepted them, if there were always those who saw them as outsiders, as mistakes, as threats, well, they'd learned to build their belonging from scratch. They'd found their people, created their community, carved out a space where they could be fully themselves. Years later, when James was grown with children of his own, when Arthur's hair had gone fully white, and Mylene's hands had developed the tremor of age, they would still walk by that creek on summer evenings. They would still hold hands and remember the day they'd chosen each other over safety, love over fear, hope over surrender. They would remember Marcus Webb and Mrs. Abernathy and Theodore Blackwell, but only as shadows that had once seemed overwhelming but had faded to irrelevance. They would remember Sarah Mitchell and Eleanor Winters and Sheriff Brody with gratitude, as the people who'd helped them survive when survival felt impossible. Most of all, they would remember the moment they'd stopped hiding, the moment they'd stood together in front of the whole town and declared their love unapologetically. That moment had changed everything, not just for them, but for everyone watching. It had shown that change was possible, that prejudice could be challenged, that love was stronger than hate. But on this 5th anniversary, with James still small and the future still unwritten, Mylene couldn't know any of that. She could only know what she felt in this moment, grateful, blessed, complete. She had survived grief and loss and found joy on the other side. She had loved and been loved in return. She had built a life that mattered, not just to herself but to the people she'd helped, the students she'd taught, the changes she'd helped create. As the sun set over the Wyoming prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Mylene Chen Hayes stood with her husband and son and felt, perhaps for the first time since childhood, that she was exactly where she belonged. Not because anyone had granted her permission to belong, but because she'd claimed that right for herself. And that, she thought, was the greatest victory of all. The creek continued its endless song, carrying their story downstream toward a future they couldn't predict but faced without fear. Together. Always together. That was enough. That was everything.